Beneath the ice, before the flood, long before maps had names, Alaska held secrets, not just bones and tools, but entire worlds lost to time, water, and silence. From vanished bloodlines to submerged villages, from dinosaur nests in darkness to Eurasian metals, no one was supposed to have. This is the edge of what science knows and where mystery begins. What if the answers we seek are buried not in what remains, but in what's missing? Welcome to Alaska Pre-Flood Mysteries Science Still Can't Explain. Some things were never meant to be found. Before we dive headfirst into the cold unknown, take a second to subscribe. It helps keep these long-lost stories alive. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Montana? 3 a.m. in Tokyo? We want to know who's out there, listening in the dark. Who arrived first and how? Somewhere in the heart of Alaska's Tanana Valley, beneath the frost-bitten silence of spruce and silt, archaeologists unearthed a grave no one expected to find. 2 infants, buried side by side in a hearth pit, wrapped in ochre and shadow. Their remains were more than 11,000 years old. What scientists got, once they cracked the genome open, was even older. A genetic signature the textbooks had quietly stopped believing in. The ancient Bingians. Now, we don't know what these infants were called, or how their families mourned them. But in death, they whispered a question so large it could rewrite the American story. Who were the first people to arrive here? And just as importantly, how did they get there? The prevailing theory for decades was pretty neat. People crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia, trudged through an ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran glaciers, and spilled into the Americas around 13,000 years ago. This Clovis first model was clean, efficient, and mostly wrong. Because the Upward Sun River infants, they weren't Clovis. They weren't even pre-Clovis. They were something else entirely. A previously unknown lineage that branched off from other Native American ancestors more than 20,000 years ago. Not cousins, not ancestors, not descendants. A ghost population, one that sat alone on a separate twig of the family tree, untouched and unclaimed. Geneticists labeled them ancient Bingians, partly because that sounds more official than admitting we have no idea what to call them. What's more unsettling is this: they don't seem to have made it. Their DNA disappears from the record, swallowed up by time, territory, or assimilation. There's no clear trace of them in later populations across the Americas. It's like they showed up, lived for millennia, and then quietly exited. But how? How does an entire branch of humanity just vanish, especially one that was already here before almost anyone else? One theory suggests that the ancient Bingians stayed north, isolated in what's now Alaska and parts of Western Canada, while other groups, those who would go on to populate North and South America, moved southward. As climate shifted, rivers rerouted, and game migrated, the ancient Bingians may have been outcompeted, absorbed, or simply faded as newer populations with more mobility and better survival strategies arrived. Another idea far more haunting is that these infants were the last of a bottlenecked people, hanging on at the edge of a continent that had already moved on without them. They weren't the beginning of a lineage. They were the end of one. The Tanana Valley is a strange place for a final chapter. It's remote, seasonal, and brutal. You can almost hear the wind mocking the notion of permanence. But here, among stone tools, mammoth bones, and ancient ash layers, lies one of the most provocative cold cases on Earth. The DNA evidence is clear. The interpretation is anything but. Anthropologists still argue over timelines, migration routes, and genetic trees that seem to knot and unknot with every new find. Some researchers think the ancient Bingians split from East Asian ancestors before the migration across Beringia ever took off. Others suspect they were the early wave, camping on the tundra before the ice-free corridor opened up, choosing instead to stay put as everyone else marched southward. So what we have is this: 2 tiny children, buried in care, lost to time, holding within them a strand of history no one fully understands. Were they part of a group that got left behind, or one that never wanted to leave in the first place? Did they watch others pass through, or did no one ever return? And here's the kicker: their grave wasn't alone. Nearby, researchers also found the cremated remains of a 3rd infant, genetically unrelated to the first 2. A clue or a coincidence? We don't know. And in Alaska, you learn quickly not to assume you ever will. This mystery isn't about who survived the Ice Age, it's about who didn't. About the lineages we lost before we even knew they existed. About all the whispers buried beneath permafrost, waiting to be heard and already half erased. And just when you think it couldn't get weirder, a tooth shows up thousands of miles away linked to the same ghostly lineage. A child, buried in a cave on the Seward Peninsula, whose DNA pulls us right back into the heart of the ancient Beringian enigma. So if you're wondering what happened to them, well, they left us a single molar. That's all. But it might just bite its way into the next layer of the puzzle. The Trail Creek Cave Child. The Seward Peninsula is where maps start to feel like speculation. Stretching west into the Bering Sea like a cracked finger pointing toward Siberia, it's a place mostly inhabited by wind, musk, oxen, and memories older than memory. And beneath one of its lonely rock faces lies a cave, Trail Creek Cave, 2 to be exact, where a child's tooth, excavated years ago and long archived, quietly defied everything we thought we knew about ancient migrations. It wasn't until 2021 that scientists took a closer look at the enamel relic. What they found was ancient DNA surprisingly intact, remarkably familiar. The child was about 9,000 years old. But more importantly, their genetic signature clustered tightly with that elusive, shadowy population we now call the ancient Bingians. And with that, the puzzle deepened. Up until that point, ancient Bingians were known only from the upward sun, river infants, 2 children buried in Alaska's interior, thousands of years earlier. But this single molar from Trail Creek Cave, tucked away in the far northwest, pushed their story forward in time and outward in geography. The ancient Bingians weren't just a blip, they had range. And now, they had endurance. But then, the questions begin. How did this child, living centuries after the presumed decline or disappearance of the ancient Beringian lineage, still carry that genetic signature? Were these people more widespread than we thought? Had they hung on longer than the models predicted? Or had their DNA simply lingered through admixture, diluted across generations, preserved in unexpected pockets of human drift? Here's the stranger thing. Modern indigenous groups in Alaska and the Yukon show no significant ancient Beringian ancestry today, which means, at some point after the Trail Creek child died, the lineage appears to have vanished again or been absorbed into something larger, subtler, harder to trace. What you're left with is a slow-burning mystery about a group that doesn't follow the usual migratory script. Most early peoples in the Americas moved. They adapted, expanded, or were replaced. But the ancient Beringians, they seem to hover fixed in place like a mythic echo, first in the Tanana Valley, then later on the edge of the Bering Sea. And Trail Creek Cave isn't just a pretty name, it's part of a system of 3 sites. Caves 1, 2, and 3 dug into ancient sediment that once held everything from Ice Age bison to bone tools shaped by human hands. The child's tooth, however, lay quietly for decades, catalogued and unlabeled, before the right person asked the right question at the right moment. What if we test it? And when they did, the results opened a door. But like most doors in prehistory, it led into fog. The real question is this: how many other ancient Beringians were there? How many Trail Creek children walked the tundra and vanished before our records begin? Did they retreat further north, resisting integration with other groups? Did they die out due to isolation, climate pressures, or slow cultural drift? Or perhaps most unsettling of all, were they not so different from the people who came after, only categorized into extinction by our need to label and partition the past? There's an irony in how we study ancient peoples. We slice time into neat segments and draw thick lines between populations that may have seen no such divisions. But the past is messier than that. The child at Trail Creek Cave could have been part of a hybrid community, one foot in the ancient Beringian world, one in the rising tide of new migrations from the north or east. There's also the landscape to consider. The Seward Peninsula is a stone's throw from what used to be Beringia, a vast Ice Age landmass connecting Asia and North America. After sea levels rose, Beringia drowned, but those who lived along its coastlines had decisions to make: stay, move, adapt, disappear. The Trail Creek child may be a symbol of that threshold, living in a liminal space between epochs, between genetic identities, between the remembered and the erased. Scientists, of course, are working on it. Ancient DNA analysis is refining faster than ever, but with every answer comes another contradiction. Why does this child show ancient Beringian ancestry, but none of their presumed descendants do? Did the lineage fracture across the landscape, or was this just one last echo preserved in a molar by sheer accident? That's the thing about Alaska. It doesn't bury its mysteries so much as it preserves them frozen in permafrost, tucked into caves, waiting for someone to dig too deep and get lost in the implications. And as researchers puzzle over this child's ancestry, one thing becomes clear. The trail doesn't end at Trail Creek. It twists southward, down the jagged coastlines and drowned shorelines, toward a different migration theory entirely, one that trades snow for seawater and ice corridors for kelp forests. Because maybe the ancient Beringians weren't alone. Maybe others arrived too, but by boat. If you're still with us, wandering the ancient ice corridors and wondering what happened to the people who vanished without a trace, now's a good time to subscribe for more deep dive mysteries like this one. And let us know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Are you in a city that never sleeps, or somewhere so quiet you can almost hear the past breathing? Coastal route versus interior route. Alaska's prehistoric map is less a matter of geography than of faith. You look at the terrain, the steep glacier-cut fjords, the drowned river valleys, the jagged coastlines, and you ask a deceptively simple question. Did the first Americans walk here or paddle? For decades, archaeologists treated the ice-free corridor theory like gospel. It painted a vivid picture. Somewhere around 13,000 years ago, two massive ice sheets, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, parted just enough to let humans slip down into what's now Alberta. From there, they fanned out across the Americas, leaving behind Clovis points and a trail of mammoth ribs, a tidy, inland migration model, crisp as a textbook diagram. But as it turns out, reality tends to be less tidy and more soggy. And it's at the southern fringe of Alaska's panhandle, specifically on Prince of Wales Island, that this story begins to wash away. Buried in the gloom of On Your Knees Cave. Yes, that's the actual name. Alaska doesn't do subtle. Scientists found the remains of a man who lived there about 10,300 years ago. His bones were tucked into limestone chambers above a now drowned shoreline, surrounded by the remnants of a coastal world. Sea otter bones, shell fragments, marine fish. But here's the strange part, he wasn't some outsider who had just paddled in. His DNA revealed something deeper, a lineage that branched off early from other Native American populations, potentially thousands of years before his death. Not only was he local, he might have descended from some of the very first coastal migrants into the Americas. Which brings us to the problem, the coastal route theory. It proposes that the first Americans didn't walk, but sailed coasting along the Pacific Rim in small watercraft, hugging kelp forests and fish-rich waters, avoiding glaciers entirely. From Japan to Kamchatka to the Aleutians, then down the Gulf of Alaska. No need for an ice-free corridor, just an open sea, an eager spirit, and enough driftwood to float your ambitions. To some archaeologists, this theory felt revolutionary. To others, it was maddeningly unprovable. Because here's the cruel irony. If ancient mariners did skirt the coast, most of their campsites now sit underwater. After the Ice Age, sea levels rose over 400 feet, drowning the ancient shorelines where these hypothetical people would have hunted, cooked, and buried their dead. The physical evidence is somewhere out there beneath the waves, beyond reach, gnawed by time and tide. Which makes On Your Knees Cave all the more precious. It sits just high enough above sea level to have survived the melt, and what it offers is not a full skeleton of the theory, but a bone fragment of possibility. But the mystery deepens further. The man from the cave, dubbed Shukaka, a Tlingit name meaning man ahead of us, shares a genetic relationship not with later Alaskans, but with South American indigenous populations. His genome clusters more closely with ancient remains found thousands of miles away in Chile, Brazil, and Patagonia than with people from the later Arctic or subarctic regions. So now the question isn't just how people got here, but why they didn't stay. Did these early coastal migrants simply pass through Alaska, following the Salmon Trail southward? Were they outnumbered or culturally displaced by later inland groups? Or was Alaska always more of a bottleneck than a homeland, a place of transition rather than settlement? There's also the matter of time. Some researchers believe that the coastal route may have opened up before the interior corridor ever did. In other words, the people who hugged the shoreline could have arrived first, pushing all the way down the Pacific coast while the great continental glaciers were still barricading the interior. That idea reshuffles everything. If true, it means that the first Americans weren't mammoth-chasing spear throwers in the Great Plains, but seaweed-eating navigators who carved paddles before they carved projectile points. Still, skeptics point out the gaps. Coastal sites are scarce, waterlogged, often buried. And until more of those early settlements are found and dated, they remain tantalizing suggestions rather than smoking spears. But then again, maybe the evidence isn't missing. Maybe it's just missing us. Submerged beneath centuries of rising tide and silt, waiting for a day when we can scan continental shelves like we scan mountain ranges. Shukaka's very presence asks a kind of philosophical question. How do you prove a journey when the trail is gone? All we're left with is the echo of waves, a few bones in a cave, and genetic signals that don't quite obey the models we've drawn. The coastal route offers no grand revelation, just fragments, driftwood clues, wet footprints dissolving under ancient tides. But what if we stop chasing corridors and think instead about settlements, about how early people built homes, not just paths? Because in the heart of Alaska's interior, there are sites, old, complex ones, suggesting that human groups weren't just passing through, but staying and changing. They weren't just exploring. They were evolving. Alaska's earliest interior camps. How early? How fast? Out in the interior, away from the rain-lashed coastlines and myth-drenched fjords, Alaska becomes something else. Not softer, never that, but quieter. It stretches flat in places, long and pale and silent. The kind of landscape where time hangs heavy, as if waiting to be carved open. And long before anyone named it Alaska, before maps tried to tame it, people were here settling, building, experimenting, and then, for reasons still unclear, moving on. This brings us to Swan Point and Dry Creek, two of the most intensively studied early archaeological sites in the subarctic north. They're situated in the Tanana Valley, a place that by all rights shouldn't be livable at the end of the Ice Age. And yet, the evidence keeps saying, people came here early, earlier than expected, and possibly faster than we thought possible. Swan Point is particularly strange. Radiocarbon dates push human activity here to around 14,000 years ago, possibly earlier, placing it among the oldest verified sites in Alaska. If that number doesn't shock you, It should. That's Ice Age timing. That's contemporary with the earliest South American sites, like Monteverde in Chile. It suggests that by the time people were leaving footprints at the bottom of the world, others had already walked deep into Alaska's interior, setting up long-term camps, shaping tools, building fires, and not just any tools, microblades. Thin, sharp flakes carefully struck from prepared stone cores, often set into composite weapons like arrows or spears. They're complex, clever, and widespread in Northeast Asia, particularly in Siberia, so their presence in Swan Point links Alaska directly to a larger Eurasian tradition. But here's the catch. The technology doesn't behave predictably. At Dry Creek, another early interior site, microblades appear in early layers, then disappear for a while, replaced by more generalized flake tools, only to return again in later strata. Archaeologists don't agree on why this happened. Some suggest shifts in subsistence needs. Others argue for cultural turnover or even independent reinvention. But the pattern refuses to settle into a neat narrative. Imagine it. A group arrives, sets up camp, uses blades so fine they could split hair. Then, for reasons unknown, they abandon the technique. The next occupants, perhaps the same people generations later, don't bother with blades. Then, much later, the blades return, like fashion or memory. So, what's really going on here? One possibility is adaptation to changing environments. The Ice Age was ending, slowly but unevenly. Caribou migrated differently. Rivers thawed earlier or later. What worked for hunting in one decade may have failed in the next. Technology isn't just inherited, it's situational. You don't need microblades when you're snaring rabbits, but you do when you're bringing down a caribou in the open tundra. Another possibility? Cultural layering. That is, multiple waves of migration coming through the same areas, each with their own toolkits and lifeways, sometimes replacing, sometimes blending. That might explain why the stratigraphy at these sites doesn't show clean transitions but strange overlaps, confusing reversals, and jarring returns. And there's a third possibility, one less comfortable, that our current timeline is wrong. That human arrival into the interior wasn't gradual at all, but fast and pulsing, in waves we haven't yet mapped, separated by centuries of silence and reoccupation. A group moves in, leaves a trace. Then, centuries later, someone else finds the ashes and does it again. The gaps aren't empty, they're just unrecorded. There's also the matter of how these early peoples got there. If the coastal route was viable as the on-your-knees cave evidence suggests, then the interior must have been a deliberate destination, not a pass-through. That reframes Alaska's heartland not as a rugged backwater, but as a desirable hub with water, megafauna, and access to wide landscapes. And yet, despite the age and richness of these camps, we still don't have clear answers about who these people were, genetically. Possibly ancestors of the ancient Bingians, or maybe part of a now-vanished side branch. Linguistically, no trace. Culturally, defined only by stone and bone. Swan Point and Dry Creek are just two data points in a wider scatter of early interior sites. But they reveal a truth that Alaska keeps repeating. Settlement wasn't linear. It was experimental, rhythmic. Groups came in, tested the margins, left clues, then vanished or merged, leaving us with a story told in ashes and chipped stone. And while archaeologists continue to puzzle over the vanishing and reappearing microblade sequences, another mystery sits farther north, waiting at the edge of the Arctic. Up there, in a place where nothing should look familiar, are stone tools that do look familiar, too familiar. Because they look like they came from 2,000 miles away. Paleoindian-looking points in the Arctic. Imagine climbing into the windswept spine of the Brooks Range, northern Alaska, where the sky never quite decides what color it wants to be. At the Mesa site, perched high above the Colville River, the tundra rolls out like a broken prayer rug, scattered bones, lichen, and stone flakes whispering old confessions. And in the frost-bitten soil here, archaeologists found something strange. Big, lanceolate spear points. And not just any spear points. These tools bear a striking resemblance to the Paleoindian points of the lower 48. The kind made famous by the Clovis and Folsom cultures, often associated with the earliest known hunters of now extinct megafauna. Long, symmetrical, well-crafted. Weapons meant to bring down large game and make a statement while doing it. But what are they doing here? Thousands of miles north of their supposed origin, these mesa points disrupt the neat regional narratives archaeologists prefer. They don't fit easily into the stylistic continuum of northern tool traditions. And worse, they resemble tools from environments radically different from the one they were found in those arid plains and temperate grasslands far to the south. So we're left with two possibilities: connection or convergence. Did people from the Paleoindian cultures of the south migrate northward, bringing their toolkit with them? Was there some cultural link, a trade, an exchange, an echo that stretched across the entire continent? Or are these just parallel inventions, arising independently because they simply worked? Archaeologists remain divided. One camp sees the mesa site as evidence of a deep-time cultural connection. They argue that people brought with them a conceptual toolkit, not just a physical one. That design choices were transmitted across generations and landscapes. If true, this would suggest a far more integrated prehistoric North America than we've assumed, where ideas moved, not just genes. The other camp says, no, it's convergence. After all, if you're trying to kill a caribou or defend yourself from a bear in a treeless tundra, there's only so many ways to shape a stone point. Maybe this design just emerged naturally from similar constraints. A form of parallel evolution, like wings in birds and bats. But there's a third, quieter question lurking here. Why this site, and why then? The mesa site dates to around 11,000 years ago, early Holocene, a time when Alaska was warming but still perilous, seasonal, harsh. And yet, whoever lived here invested time in crafting points that were more elaborate than necessary for simple survival. They weren't just functional, they were expressive. That raises the possibility that these tools were not just weapons, but also symbols of identity, of belonging, of ancestral memory. Maybe these hunters were invoking a style they'd only heard about through stories, copying a design they never saw firsthand, only inherited through oral tradition. What's haunting is how isolated the mesa site is. It's not part of a bustling cultural network like later Thule sites. It stands alone, windswept and quiet, a sentinel over time. And the points themselves? They stopped showing up after this period. Whatever cultural stream they belonged to, if it was a stream evaporated or folded into something else. So what we're left with is a flicker, a brief flare of a tool tradition that doesn't quite belong, lighting up in the Arctic like a flare from another continent. A riddle shaped in stone and left behind by people who understood the land in ways we're still guessing at. And the thing about flares is, they draw attention. Downriver, on the Kobuk River, lies another puzzle. A site with 10,000 years of occupation, stacked in perfect sedimentary memory. Culture after culture, one on top of the next, all watching the same place, waiting for the caribou to cross. Onion Portage's 10,000 years in a cut bank. Stand at Onion Portage during the fall migration, and you'll hear them before you see them, the caribou, thousands of them. A dark, flowing current of life splashing through the river shallows, antlers rising like waves. It's one of the few places where the land itself becomes predictable, where you could set your calendar by hooves and instinct. And that's exactly what people did for 10,000 years straight. Onion Portage is carved into a bend of the Kobuk River, and it's not a normal archaeological site. It's a time machine. A steep riverbank eroded just enough to expose layer upon layer of human occupation. 13 cultural levels stacked like geological cordwood, ranging from the Denali complex all the way to historic Ipiutak settlements. You can see the sediment layers like tree rings. One group leaves behind stone knives and charcoal. Centuries pass. Another builds on top of them with new tools, new bones, new stories, then another, then another. Like the place itself was magnetic, as if every generation had the same realization. If you want to eat, you wait here. The predictability of the caribou crossing turned this spot into a kind of prehistoric metropolis. Seasonal, yes, but vital. And the tools found here chart the story of cultural change in the Arctic better than almost anywhere else. From flake tools to microblades, from bone harpoons to pottery sherds, the site captures a full arc of adaptation. But the most haunting aspect of Onion Portage is not its age, it's the pulses. Occupation wasn't continuous. There are gaps, layers where people stopped coming, sometimes for centuries. Then suddenly, they returned. Different toolkit, different strategies. But always to the same bend in the river. Why? One theory points to climate shifts. The Arctic isn't static, it breathes, it convulses. A colder period could drive caribou off their usual paths. Warmer periods might open new ones. When the herds changed, the people changed with them or disappeared. Another theory leans more spiritual. Places like this, where success repeated across centuries, often acquire symbolic meaning. Perhaps people returned not just to hunt, but to connect with ancestral power, to fulfill obligations, to participate in rituals older than memory. The sediment isn't just archaeological, it's sacred. But there's also something unsettling here. The deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. Cultures didn't evolve smoothly. They vanished. They reappeared. They skipped steps. Styles reversed. It's not a line, it's a waveform. There are moments where more advanced tools give way to simpler ones. Other times when new materials seem to appear from nowhere. This suggests not just environmental flux, but social experimentation. Groups may have deliberately abandoned certain technologies or lost them. Or perhaps they interacted with incoming groups, absorbing or resisting foreign ideas. So, what we're looking at in Onion Portage isn't just a record of who came here. It's a record of how human memory behaves in a place without written language. The stories were carved into habit, not paper. And when a generation forgot or wandered, the land waited. Today, Onion Portage continues to erode. Every flood season strips away another inch, but each inch reveals something older. More tools, more bones, more gaps. Every stratum a question, every silence a drumbeat. And just downriver from this deep time memory bank lies another site less layered, but perhaps even stranger, not built on caribou trails, but on beach ridges, hundreds of them, each one holding a slice of time, each one a riddle. Because sometimes, the coastline keeps better time than the people living on it. Cape Krusenstern's Beach Ridge Time Machine. From the air, Cape Krusenstern looks like someone took a rake to the coastline and left behind a series of perfect, wind-sculpted ridges. These long, curling arcs, hundreds of them line the Chukchi Sea like prehistoric fingerprints pressed into gravel. To the untrained eye, it's just another Arctic beach, bleak, repetitive, remote. But to archaeologists, Cape Krusenstern is a clock, a very strange one, and it doesn't tick, it rises. Each ridge marks a former shoreline, and on these ridges, campsites, hearths, tools, bone fragments, layers of human life, stretched across time like laundry on a line. What's astonishing isn't just that people lived here, it's that they kept coming back. For thousands of years, always building on the newest ridge, the most recent slice of stable land. Generation after generation, they moved inland, not by choice, but by ocean retreat. In essence, Cape Krusenstern offers something rare in Arctic archaeology: sequence. Not the buried vertical layers like Onion Portage, but horizontal time, each ridge a chapter, each distance inland a different millennium, a literal, walkable map of human adaptation. But here's the riddle. Why here? This part of Alaska isn't particularly fertile. The terrain is rocky, the weather unforgiving, and the vegetation sparse. And yet, people returned here again and again. The site shows signs of occupation spanning at least 4,000 years, possibly more. Some scholars argue it's all about the rich marine life: seals, fish, migratory birds. But that only explains part of it. After all, other stretches of Arctic coast offer similar resources, yet they don't show the same relentless reoccupation. So the deeper question becomes, what made this stretch of land special? One theory ties the settlements to climate cycles. During warmer periods, the sea ice receded and beach ridges built up faster, providing fresh land for camping. In colder centuries, ice-choked shorelines slowed ridge formation. The pattern of human occupation might therefore track not only sea levels, but atmospheric shifts. The site becomes both calendar and barometer. But even with this climate model, something doesn't quite fit. Some ridges are occupied heavily, others show barely a footprint. And the changes in technology from early chipped stone to later bone tools to even ceramics don't always match the environmental shifts. This suggests something more dynamic at play. Perhaps cultural cycles, where different groups used Cape Krusenstern for very different reasons. Maybe some came to hunt, others to trade. Some stayed only a season, others a generation. Perhaps some ridges represent refuge from storm, famine, or conflict. Others might have served ceremonial functions, marked by the presence of hearths with no clear economic purpose. In this way, Cape Krusenstern becomes less of a village site and more of a palimpsest, a scroll of overlapping intents, rewritten again and again by people responding not just to nature, but to each other. It's a site that refuses to be narrowed to one interpretation. It tells you, yes, humans were here, but don't ask what they were doing. That changes every 40 meters. And just when you think you're starting to grasp it, tracking the coastal logic, counting the beach ridges like rings on a tree trunk, you hit a different kind of mystery, a cultural break. A point where the toolkits, the housing styles, and even the subsistence patterns shift abruptly. Which brings us to the Denbigh Flint complex, a tradition so widespread, so sophisticated, and so enigmatic that it forces the Cape's chronology to pause and pivot. Because the Denbigh people weren't just making tools, they were redefining survival. 7 mysteries deep, and we've barely scratched the permafrost. If your brain's tingling and your coffee's gone cold, now's the perfect moment to subscribe. This rabbit hole only gets darker. And while you're here, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it on your end? Are you drifting off in the Arctic night, or wide awake somewhere warmer, wondering how much we'll ever really know? Denbigh Flint Complex. How does it really fit? The Denbigh Flint Complex might sound like a real estate development. In reality, it's one of the most mysterious, far-reaching technological traditions in Arctic prehistory. Named after Cape Denbigh, a rugged outcrop on the Seward Peninsula, this culture left behind an unmistakable archaeological signature. Finely crafted microblades, burins, scrapers, and specialized tools, all small enough to lose in your pocket and sharp enough to skin a seal in one motion. The craftsmanship is meticulous. Not crude survival gear, but precision work, often involving exotic materials like obsidian and high-quality chert. Whoever these people were, they weren't just getting by. They were innovators, navigating one of Earth's harshest environments with a level of technical refinement that still impresses modern flint-knappers. But that brings us to the puzzle. Where do they fit? Chronologically, the Denbigh tradition appears around 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, after the big Paleoarctic cultures, but before the emergence of pottery-bearing groups like the Norton. Spatially, Denbigh sites are scattered across a huge swath of western and northern Alaska, suggesting wide mobility or influence. And culturally, well, that's where things get slippery. Some researchers place Denbigh as a precursor to the Norton tradition, which introduced pottery and semi-subterranean house forms. But others argue that Denbigh represents a parallel system, a different lifeway entirely, more specialized in inland hunting and marine edge foraging, without the later hallmarks of village life and technological comfort. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Take the site of Ipiutak, for example, the namesake location where the Denbigh complex was first defined. New excavations there have revised older dates and added new context, suggesting that the Denbigh people weren't just coastal, they ranged inland, possibly seasonally, tracking caribou and working quarries. Some sites show intense occupation, others suggest quick, specialized visits. This fluidity has led some scholars to think of the Denbigh as a kind of tactical culture, not fixed, not tribal in the traditional sense, but mobile, adaptive, and spread out like a loose network. What's most intriguing is the question of subsistence balance. Were the Denbigh people marine foragers who occasionally ventured inland, or inland hunters who sometimes harvested coastal resources? The artifact record shows both, but not in ways that cleanly line up with climate or location. In fact, some of the densest inland sites show more marine tool types, while coastal sites sometimes lack marine indicators entirely. This suggests a complex cultural ecology, where lifestyle didn't just follow geography, it responded to it, negotiated with it, rearranged it. And just as we begin to get a handle on Denbigh, they vanish, or rather, transform. Pottery appears, house forms change, toolkits expand, subsistence strategies shift, and suddenly, we're in Norton territory. But here's the problem. No clean handoff. No neat boundary layer in the dirt where Denbigh ends and Norton begins. Instead, there's a messy, overlapping record that suggests blending, borrowing, competing, or maybe all of the above, which leaves one final question hanging in the frost-thick air. Were the Denbigh people replaced, or did they evolve? Did they disappear under pressure from new arrivals? Or did their children start making pots and building different houses because the world demanded it? And what about those pots? Where did they come from? Because when pottery enters the scene in Alaska, it doesn't crawl in gradually. It jumps in, already functional, already weird, already full of implications no one can quite agree on. And just like that, the archaeological record throws another curveball. Where did Alaska's first pottery come from? Pottery, in theory, is supposed to be the hallmark of a settled life. You make it when you have time, when you stop moving long enough to carry a fragile vessel instead of a hide-wrapped bundle. You don't drag clay pots across tundra. They're not survival gear. They're a statement. We're staying here, at least for a while. So, it should be a slow development, gradual, regional, logical. But in Alaska, pottery doesn't arrive slowly. It erupts. The earliest known ceramics in the region appear with the Chorus culture, roughly 2,700 years ago, mostly around the western coast and the Kotzebue Sound. What's odd, aside from the fact that it seems to arrive out of nowhere, is that it comes in fully formed. These aren't crude, experimental clay globs. They're fiber-tempered, fired pots with clear functional designs. Someone knew what they were doing. So, where did that knowledge come from? One hypothesis suggests a link to northeast Siberia, where fiber-tempered ceramics predate Alaska's by several centuries. Maybe small seafaring groups made the crossing, bringing their pottery techniques along with them. After all, the Bering Strait is only about 50 miles wide at its narrowest, less, if you count the stepping stone islands in between. And we know there was pre-contact movement across it. Trade, travel, probably even intermarriage. The timing, however, is fuzzy. The Siberian ceramics aren't identical, and there's no clear trail of intermediate forms linking the two regions. It's as if the idea of pottery just leaps the strait, bypassing the messy diffusion we're used to seeing. Another theory leans toward independent innovation, suggesting that pottery may have been developed locally in response to new subsistence strategies, particularly around fish processing. As marine resources became more central, Boiling food in ceramic vessels could offer better yields, more storage, or even a tastier result. The trouble is, there's no clear transitional phase in the archaeological record. No half-baked test pots. No failed attempts. Just finished vessels functional, tempered, and present across multiple sites at once. In essence, pottery in Alaska behaves like a cultural software update, not a technology learned slowly over time. It installs, boots, and runs already compatible with the system of life. But the mystery deepens when we ask, why here and why now? Why would the chorus culture adopt pottery when previous groups survived perfectly well with hide containers and stone boiling? Why risk brittle clay in an environment where almost nothing is forgiving? Some archaeologists suggest social signaling. Pottery, especially decorated pottery, might have served as a way to mark identity, show status, or convey ritual significance. Even if functional, it might have also been symbolic, a public object, a canvas for meaning. And in that light, its sudden appearance could reflect not just utility, but ideological change, a shift in how people saw food, family, and permanence. The real sting is that we still don't know if chorus pottery was invented, inherited, or imported. All three theories remain on the table, and none can fully account for the evidence. Which means that every shard of early ceramic found in Alaska isn't just broken, it's incomplete. And if the mystery of where pottery came from haunts us, the mystery of how it was used doesn't make things any easier. Because these weren't ornamental vases or delicate ceremonial urns. They were workhorses, utilitarian, frequently charred, and they smell like salmon. What was Norton pottery used for exactly? By the time the Norton tradition develops roughly 2,500 to 1,000 years ago, pottery in Alaska has already settled in. It's no longer novel, it's necessary. Norton people spread across a wide swath of western and northern Alaska, leaving behind house depressions, middens, tools, and perhaps most tellingly, broken pots. These vessels are thicker than chorus pottery, heavier, less ornate. They weren't made to impress, they were made to function. And when researchers began running residue analysis on fragments, one smell kept coming back: salmon. It makes intuitive sense. Pottery gives you more control over heat. It lets you boil, simmer, preserve, and in an ecosystem where salmon runs are massive but seasonal, that control matters. Norton ceramics may have allowed for oil extraction, fish broth, or food preparation methods that extended shelf life in ways hides and baskets couldn't plus. But here's the twist. While salmon dominates the residue record at some sites, it's not universal. Other pots show signs of seal oil, caribou fat, or mixed plant residues. This suggests that pottery wasn't specialized for one use, it was general purpose, but adapted locally. A Norton pot in one village might boil fish heads. In another, it might render seal blubber. In another, it might do both and host a ritual meal besides. And yet, pottery never spreads evenly. In some areas, it's everywhere. In others, it's strangely absent, even when other Norton cultural markers are present. Why? One theory is mobility. Pottery is fragile and heavy. Nomadic groups may have skipped it in favor of lighter alternatives, like hide bags or wooden containers. Sedentary or semi-sedentary communities, especially those along rich fishing grounds, may have invested more in clay. Another theory is cultural preference. Pottery use might have been shaped more by tradition and belief than by climate or convenience. One community's necessity could be another's taboo. And then there's the archaeology problem. Pots break. They don't preserve well in acidic soils. In some regions, entire layers of occupation could be ceramic-rich and invisible to current methods. So what do we know? We know Norton pottery was used, heavily, often, for food, but beyond that, the picture gets hazy. Was it tied to feasting rituals? Did its shape change depending on intended use? Were pots made communally or individually? Did they carry personal markings? Most of these questions remain open. And then, almost as mysteriously as it appeared, pottery in Alaska begins to decline in some regions. Other technologies rise: soapstone lamps, new storage strategies, advanced hunting tools. The ceramic record fractures, then fades. But just before it does, in one of the coldest, most remote places in the Arctic, a new culture rises. They build enormous communities. They bury their dead with unmatched care. Their art is delicate, intricate, obsessive even. And yet, despite all this cultural complexity, they seem to have rejected pottery entirely. Their name? The Ipiutak. And they are, by every account, an archaeological contradiction. The Ipiutak enigma at Point Hope. The Ipiutak people should not exist the way they do. By the time they emerge around 2,000 years ago, most Arctic cultures are trending toward utilitarianism, efficiency, tools made for hunting, for processing, for surviving. But the Ipiutak, they go the other way. Their settlements, especially at Point Hope, are packed with exquisite ivory carvings, elaborately adorned graves, and artifacts that whisper a symbolic language we still don't understand. And yet, despite all the evidence of complexity, of trade, of ritual, of art, they seem to have eschewed two core technologies their neighbors widely embraced: pottery and whaling. Let's pause on that. Here's a culture that lives on the coast, has access to sea mammals, and builds large, permanent settlements. But there's no clear evidence they hunted whales, and there's no pottery. Instead, they leave behind sprawling cemeteries, intricate burial masks, and what appear to be ceremonial items made from walrus ivory and bone. Their houses are large, semi-subterranean, and grouped together in ways that suggest strong social organization, possibly kinship-based or ritual in function. So, what were they doing? One interpretation is that Ipiutak culture was ritual-heavy, that their economy wasn't driven by whale blubber or ceramic cooking pots, but by social capital status, lineage, ceremonial roles. Ivory carvings found at the site include mythological creatures, human-animal hybrids, and symbols that have no obvious utilitarian purpose. Were these spiritual tools? Clan identifiers? Proto-writing? No one knows. And the burial practices deepen the mystery. Some individuals were buried with elaborate goods, others with almost nothing. The presence of whalebone markers at some graves suggests ritual importance, but without direct evidence of whaling in the settlement debris, archaeologists are left guessing. Did they trade for whale parts with neighboring groups? Did they hunt, but only opportunistically? Or did their spiritual beliefs prohibit direct whale hunting? We may never know. What's clear is that the Ipiutak represent a cultural fork, a path not taken by later Arctic societies. They appear, they flourish, and then, within a few centuries, they vanish. Replaced or absorbed by other traditions, possibly the rising Birnirk culture, whose members didn't hesitate to hunt whales or make pots. So the Ipiutak stand as a reminder: not all complexity looks the same. Sometimes the most advanced cultures are the least legible. Their tools aren't for killing, their houses aren't for hiding. Their art doesn't explain, it provokes. And somewhere in the fog of their disappearance, a transition takes place. Not a collapse, a transformation. Because the people who came next didn't carve myths into ivory. They built snow houses, they tracked bowhead whales, they mapped ice flows, and they moved fast, Birnirk to Thule. How did the transition happen? Up along the wind-scoured Arctic coasts, where the tundra meets the ice-choked sea, a quiet revolution unfolded. It didn't happen overnight, nothing does in the Arctic, but by the time it was over, the North had changed. The houses were different, the tools were different. The scale of movement, of ambition, of presence completely transformed. This is the murky threshold between the Birnirk culture and the Thule tradition, and it's one of the most consequential, least understood transitions in Arctic prehistory. At first glance, the two might seem like cultural cousins. Both built semi-subterranean houses, insulated with sod and bone. Both hunted sea mammals, particularly bowhead whales. Both worked ivory with delicate precision. But when you zoom out chronologically, geographically, technologically, the Thule expansion doesn't look like evolution. It looks like acceleration. The Birnirk culture, named after the site at Birnirk Point near Utqiagvik, formerly Barrow, occupied northern Alaska between roughly 1,100 and 700 years ago. They were competent whalers, skilled tool makers, and part of a long-standing Arctic lineage. Then suddenly, in the space of just a few centuries, the Thule believed to be their direct descendants exploded across the Arctic, from western Alaska to Greenland. That's a range of over 4,000 miles, covered in what seems like the cultural equivalent of a sprint. It's one of the fastest known prehistoric migrations in human history. So, what changed? The answer may lie in the bowhead whale. Thule people didn't just hunt them, they built societies around them. They developed large, coordinated hunting crews, used sophisticated boats like umiaks, and constructed communal houses with whalebone frames. Their settlements expanded not just in size, but in complexity. You start to see infrastructure, caches, storage pits, even snow houses built for winter mobility. Some archaeologists believe this transformation was ecological. A medieval warm period brought thinner sea ice and shifted whale migration routes northward, opening up new hunting grounds and encouraging movement. Others point to technological advances, improved harpoons, larger boats, better storage. Still, others think social change drove it, that rising population density created pressure to spread out, claim new territory, build new alliances. And yet, despite the archaeological evidence of change, the details remain blurry. The Birnirk to Thule transition doesn't play out in a single site or sequence. It's scattered, fragmented. One site shows a hybrid toolkit, another shows a sudden cultural switch. In some areas, they overlap. In others, Birnirk just vanishes. What's equally puzzling is that Thule culture doesn't emerge fully formed in Alaska. The classic Thule traits, massive whale hunting villages, advanced toggling harpoons, dog sleds, long-distance trade networks, become most visible as the Thule move east into Canada and Greenland. It's as if their cultural identity matured in motion, gaining complexity with each new expansion. So what does that make Birnirk? A cultural foundation? A point of origin? Or something more ambiguous? A shared ancestor, perhaps, but not the same species of society? Some scholars propose that Thule identity was assembled, rather than inherited. Bits of Birnirk, yes, but also innovations adopted from inland hunters, coastal neighbors, even possibly remnants of earlier groups like the Ipiutak. In this view, the Thule weren't just descendants, they were synthesists, combining what worked into something unprecedented. And the synthesis wasn't just practical, it was ideological. You can see it in their burial practices, their house layouts, their use of amulets and symbolic carvings. The Thule world was bigger, not just geographically, but cognitively. It required new ways of organizing space, time, and social memory. So the mystery isn't just how the Birnirk people turned into the Thule. It's how a regional culture became a trans-Arctic civilization. And somewhere along this trajectory, a quieter legacy was carved. Not into whalebone, but into ivory. Not functional, but symbolic. Stylized faces, spirals, eyes that never close. A visual language without translation, etched by people we now call Old Bering Sea or Ukvik. Their art tells a different story, one that doesn't care about utility, one that stares back. Old Bering Sea, Ukvik art. What do the motifs mean? The first thing you notice about Old Bering Sea, OBS and Ukvik art is that it doesn't ask to be understood. It isn't explanatory. It isn't decorative. It's obsessive. It's haunting. It demands attention and then refuses to tell you what it means. Carved into walrus, ivory knife handles, combs, needle cases, ritual items, these swirling, deeply incised motifs appeared across street. Lawrence Island and other Bering Sea outposts between roughly 2,000 and 1,000 years ago. Their style is instantly recognizable. Scrolling spirals, dot-filled eyes, animal-human hybrids, faces nested within faces. This was not casual decoration. This was a visual grammar. But of what? Some archaeologists interpret the motifs as symbolic maps of the spirit world, visions of transformation, of animal to human, and back again. Others suggest they represent clan identities, mythic ancestors, or totemic emblems. Still others believe they're part of a ritual logic, icons meant to mark sacred objects or ceremonial roles. But here's the problem. There's no written record, no oral tradition that survived intact, no Rosetta Stone of the Bering Sea. We're left to interpret these carvings across a chasm of time, culture, and translation errors. The distinction between Oakvik and OBS art is subtle but significant. Oakvik, the earlier phase, is more abstract, more feminine. Some say favoring ovoid shapes and smooth, symmetric contours. OBS art, which follows, is denser, more aggressive in its line work, often packed with facial features and intricate cross-hatching. Some researchers think the shift reflects a spiritual escalation, a growing complexity in cosmological belief. Others think it mirrors socio-economic change. More trade, more hierarchy, more need for symbolic status markers. Because these artifacts weren't scattered randomly, they show up in elite burials, ritual caches, and well-appointed dwellings. Their distribution suggests that whoever made and owned them was somebody. But again, we're guessing, because some tools that seem decorative also show clear signs of wear, and some of the most intricately carved items were never used. Were these talismans, trophies, objects of power passed down through generations? Or were they made for the dead, to escort them into a world where humans walk on all fours and animals speak in riddles? One theory posits that these motifs weren't just artistic but mnemonic, a kind of memory aid for stories, chants, or taboos. In this sense, the carvings may have encoded narratives, ancestral journeys, cosmological battles, migrations, not readable in the modern sense, but interpretable by those who knew the code. And then, there's the uncanny uniformity. The style spread far across the Bering Sea, from Street Lawrence Island to the Chukchi coast. That kind of stylistic coherence suggests more than trade. It suggests a shared ideological framework, perhaps even a belief system stretching across linguistic or tribal boundaries. But just like the Ipiutak, the OBS tradition doesn't last forever. By the time the Thule cultural wave crashes across the Arctic, this art style begins to recede. It doesn't disappear entirely, but it changes, simplifies, becomes harder to recognize. And maybe that's the saddest part, because in those swirling motifs, you can almost feel someone trying to hold on to something, a vision, a mythology, a self-image made of ivory and imagination. And just when you think you've grasped the meaning, you stumble upon a burial, rich in goods, marked with a whalebone, a human presence, frozen in status, waiting, watching, and very much not alone. Status and ceremony on Street Lawrence Island. There's a particular stillness to Street Lawrence Island, an island adrift in the Bering Sea, close enough to Russia to see it on a clear day, yet culturally and archaeologically locked in its own dimension. The land here is low, windswept, unyielding. Nothing about it invites luxury. And yet, buried beneath its permafrost, we find ceremony, structure, and status terms that feel out of place in such a stark setting, but which show up anyway, carved into bone and ivory. One such revelation came from a Punuk-era burial, dating back about 1,000 years, uncovered near a whalebone marker and accompanied by a surprisingly rich array of goods, tools, ornaments, worked ivory, and what may have been ritual items. The burial wasn't just a body, it was a statement. And it poses a difficult question. How widespread was social differentiation, the formalized recognition of status, wealth, or spiritual role on this island, and by extension, across the broader prehistoric Arctic? In many traditional views of Arctic cultures, especially pre-contact ones, societies are portrayed as largely egalitarian. Harsh environments, after all, reward cooperation over competition. You don't survive an Arctic winter by being the richest man in the village. You survive because someone shares their seal meat when your hunting luck runs dry. But burials like this one complicate that narrative. The grave goods weren't utilitarian, they were expressive, decorative, possibly ceremonial. And their inclusion in the burial hints at a system of social memory, where some individuals were remembered, marked, and elevated above others. That kind of symbolic hierarchy doesn't necessarily mean kings and queens, but it does suggest a structure roles that mattered, perhaps tied to spiritual knowledge, lineage, or economic function. And it's not an isolated case. Across Street Lawrence Island, both Punuk and earlier old Bering Sea sites show patterns of selective burial goods. Some individuals went into the earth with arms full of ivory, others with nothing. So what does it mean? Some archaeologists argue these patterns reflect achieved status rewards for exceptional hunters, skilled artisans, or individuals who played key social roles. Others suggest the existence of inherited status, where some lineages were simply considered more prestigious, tied to mythic ancestors or territorial rights. But there's another, less discussed angle: ritual economy. In this view, the goods aren't just displays of wealth, they're offerings. The burial isn't about remembering a person, it's about negotiating with the spirit world. Send the dead off with tools, carvings, and markers, and perhaps they'll guide the living from the other side. In that case, the lavishness of the burial reflects spiritual obligation, not social class. Still, the presence of whalebone as a grave marker is hard to ignore. Whalebone is heavy. It's valuable. It doesn't end up at a gravesite by accident. Its use in marking this burial suggests a level of ceremonial planning and maybe even public participation, a statement to the living as much as to the dead. This person mattered. And the island itself adds to the puzzle. Street Lawrence sits at a crossroads part of Alaska, but deeply connected to Siberia. For centuries, even millennia, people here were part of Beringian exchange networks, moving goods, styles, and genes across the strait. That means the social structures we see in Punuk-era burials might not be purely local. They might be part of a pan-Arctic ideology, in which objects, especially elaborately carved ones, weren't just tools, but social currency. Ivory carvings, for example, may have functioned as more than art. They could have been tokens of identity, passed down through generations, tied to stories, places, or spirits. Their inclusion in burials, then, isn't decoration, it's declaration. A message to both the community and the cosmos. And yet, these patterns don't remain static. Later archaeological layers show a shift. Burial practices simplify. Grave goods become rarer. Whalebone markers disappear. Whether this reflects a real cultural change or simply a change in preservation is unclear. But it forces us to ask, was there a rise and fall of social hierarchy on the island? Did the symbolism of earlier times fade, get replaced, or go underground? One could argue that as environmental pressures increased, or external contacts intensified, traditional systems of status and ceremony were destabilized. Or perhaps the symbolic language simply changed, becoming less material, more performative. Not every ritual leaves a footprint. Either way, the story of this burial and the social system it hints at doesn't end with a single skeleton. It leads into a broader, stranger pattern across the Arctic, where houses were more than shelters. They were statements, Structures built not just to shield from wind, but to express something about belief, identity, and the invisible lines that divide kin from stranger, insider from outcast. Because when you look closely at the architecture itself, whalebone frames, driftwood beams, half-buried floors, you realize they weren't just building homes. They were building worldviews. Whalebone and driftwood houses, architecture or ideology. If you were to stumble across the remnants of a prehistoric Arctic dwelling today, half swallowed by tundra and time, you might not realize what you were looking at: a ring of stone, a depression in the ground, a tangled knot of bone and driftwood peeking through the moss. But to the people who built them, these weren't just places to eat, sleep, and hide from the wind. They were manifestos, silent ones, built from the materials the sea left behind, saying something about who belonged inside and who didn't. Across the Arctic, but especially in regions like coastal Alaska and St. Lawrence Island, people built semi-subterranean houses that used local materials to stunning effect. Walls were dug into the earth. Roofs were formed from whale ribs, vertebrae, and driftwood. Sod and turf packed in the insulation. Entrances were long, narrow tunnels, sometimes symbolic, sometimes practical, always intentional. It was an architecture of necessity, yes, but also of meaning. Let's start with the practical. In a treeless tundra, whalebone and driftwood were gold. Trees didn't grow, so wood had to float in carried by rivers or ocean currents, often from hundreds of miles away. Whalebone, meanwhile, came with risk. You couldn't get it unless someone had the skill, gear, and courage to bring down a leviathan. Or, perhaps more realistically in earlier periods, you scavenged it from strandings already rare, already precious. So every beam, every rib, every vertebra embedded in a roofline meant something had been won. Something had been carried, hauled, and arranged with deliberate care. You didn't waste materials like these. And you didn't live under them casually? But the real mystery lies in how varied these houses are, and what those variations might have meant. Across sites like Wales, Point Hope, and Cape Espenberg, we see differences in size, layout, and complexity. Some houses were large enough to host extended families or ritual gatherings. Others were compact, minimal. Some were clustered tightly in what appeared to be organized villages. Others stood alone, overlooking coastal cliffs or inland trails. What governed these decisions? Environment, yes, but also ideology. There's growing evidence that these houses were more than functional shelters. They were cosmological spaces. Entrances often faced a particular direction. Interior divisions may have mapped onto spiritual beliefs separating male and female spaces, human and animal zones, life and afterlife. In some ethnographic analogues from later periods, the entrance tunnel symbolized a birth canal, a rebirth into the protected world of kin, warmth, and memory. Some houses were marked externally with whale bones, deliberate signals, visible from a distance, perhaps denoting status, lineage, or ritual purpose. Others contained subfloor caches, pits dug beneath the living space to hold tools, food, or symbolic items. Were these just storage spaces, or offerings to spirits beneath the floor? And then there's the construction itself. It wasn't done haphazardly. Many houses used precise layering, bone, wood, sod, turf, in a consistent sequence. Some even show signs of planned renovation over time. Occupants didn't just maintain their homes, they reimagined them. Sometimes they tore them down and built right over the same spot. Other times, they moved just a few feet away, leaving the old structure to collapse into memory. Why? One theory suggests these dwellings were seen as living entities, not just homes, but ancestors. When they outlived their usefulness, they weren't just abandoned. They were retired, even ritually buried in some cases. There are accounts of older structures being filled in deliberately, not erased but sealed, as though the house itself deserved closure. And this isn't just Arctic metaphor, it's structural fact. In some sites, researchers have found layers of turf, stone, and refuse deliberately piled over the remains of old houses, forming mounds that resemble burial cairns. Whether this was symbolic or simply sanitary is debatable, but the repetition suggests a pattern, not an accident. The other side of the mystery lies in who built these houses. Was construction communal? Was it gendered? Did certain families control the best materials? Or did the community pool its resources? Some ethnographic parallels suggest that house construction was a deeply ritualized process, often tied to family rites, clan stories, or seasonal ceremonies. And what about ownership? Were houses passed down through generations, like names and tools? Were they abandoned and reclaimed by others? The archaeological record is suggestive, but far from complete. In some regions, we see patterns of long-term occupation. In others, the houses seem to flicker into use and vanish. But perhaps that's the point. These weren't just buildings. They were narratives, spatial expressions of belief, identity, memory. Every rib bone in the roof spoke of a hunt, a journey, a storm. Every driftwood post whispered of distant forests, long rivers, and saltwater paths. These homes held knowledge, encoded not in words, but in angles, materials, and orientation. Which brings us to the next paradox. While houses told one kind of story grounded, local, inherited the movement of obsidian artifacts tells quite another. Because those little black flakes of volcanic glass, they don't belong to the places where they're found. They come from far away, across rivers, across mountain ranges, across time. Some of them come from sources we still haven't mapped, obsidian highways we can't fully see. In the sweeping narrative of Alaska's deep past, carved in mammoth tusks, scattered in seal bones, etched into weathered ivory, it's easy to focus on the weighty grounded things. Houses dug into frozen earth, whalebone grave markers, ceramic fragments hardened in fire. But then, out of the silt and loam, comes something sharp, light, and almost too perfect: obsidian. Volcanic glass, black as night, brittle as sin, and sharp enough to split hair. It doesn't just cut, it sculpts reality. And for prehistoric people, it wasn't merely a tool-making material. It was currency, status symbol, identity tag, and trail marker, all rolled into one. In Alaska, the most prominent obsidian source is Batsatena, a remote outcrop tucked in the eastern Koyukuk River Valley, deep in the Brooks Range foothills. From a distance, it looks like just another hunk of wilderness, but beneath its weather-beaten slopes lies one of the most intensively used obsidian quarries in North America. For over 10,000 years, people climbed these ridges to collect razor-sharp nodules, carry them away, and shape them into tools that could change hands, stories, or destinies. And those tools traveled. Obsidian from Batsatena has been found hundreds of miles away, scattered across western Alaska, into the Yukon, even in sites near the Bering Sea. That in itself is remarkable. What's more remarkable? Some obsidian artifacts don't match any known geochemical source. Not Batsatena, not Wrangell, not Wiki Peak, not any of the mapped volcanic fields. In other words, some of this material comes from obsidian highways we can't fully see. Let's break this down. Every obsidian source has a unique geochemical fingerprint, a cocktail of trace elements like zirconium, barium, and strontium that makes it as identifiable as a barcode. When archaeologists find an obsidian flake at a distant site, they can often trace it back to its origin with laboratory precision. It's like solving a prehistoric shipping manifest. But then you find a flake that doesn't match anything, that doesn't scan. That raises the question, where was this piece from, and how did it get here? There are a few possibilities, none of them simple. One is that we've only mapped the obvious sources. Alaska's vast, and many regions remain archaeologically underexplored. The unknown obsidian could come from now inaccessible or undiscovered sources, buried by landslides, ice, or forests. In this case, the mystery isn't cultural, it's geological. We just haven't found the quarry yet. Another possibility is long-distance movement. These outlier artifacts might have come from far outside Alaska, traded through extended networks stretching down the Pacific coast, up from interior British Columbia, or even across the Bering Strait from Chukotka. In this scenario, obsidian wasn't just a material, it was a message, a portable connection to faraway people and places. And then there's the unsettling third option. These artifacts represent lost sources, quarries that were known, used, and revered by ancient peoples, then abandoned or erased by environmental change. In this reading, obsidian becomes a relic not just of trade, but of forgotten geographies, landscapes that existed when sea levels were lower, or when glaciers had retreated just enough to make travel feasible. No matter the answer, the fact remains, obsidian doesn't move on its own. It had to be carried by foot, by boat, by hand-to-hand exchanges that probably included stories, rituals, and obligations. You don't give obsidian lightly. It cuts both ways, literally and metaphorically. And what makes it all the more intriguing is that most of the obsidian artifacts aren't prestige items. They're not ceremonial daggers or ornate bladelets. They're ordinary, scraper tools, projectile points, broken flakes, everyday objects made from extraordinary material. So why go through the trouble of acquiring obsidian from so far away? Some argue it was simply superior technology. Obsidian can produce sharper edges than chert or quartzite. It makes cleaner cuts, faster kills, more efficient processing. That would make it worth the journey, or at least worth trading for. Others suggest a more symbolic function. In many cultures, obsidian is associated with protection, danger, and power. It can reflect like a mirror. It gleams like ice. It's dangerous if mishandled. These qualities may have given it spiritual value a sacred edge, reserved for specific rituals or people. There's also the social angle. Obsidian could mark networks who you knew, who you traded with, who you trusted. A flake of Batsatena obsidian in a coastal village might say, "We are part of something larger." A shard from an unmapped source might say, "We remember a place that you've forgotten." But perhaps the most important thing obsidian tells us is this: mobility mattered. People weren't just surviving, they were moving, exploring, exchanging, experimenting. They weren't isolated bands huddled around fires, they were dynamic agents in a constantly shifting Arctic world. And when you follow the obsidian trail far enough through river valleys, across mountain passes, along storm-battered shores, you start to notice something else. It ends at the ocean. And beneath that ocean lies the lost world of Beringia, a place that connected continents, a place now drowned, a place full of camps we still haven't found, Beringia's drowned camps. Imagine standing at the edge of the Bering Sea and staring out over water that, not so long ago, archaeologically speaking, was land. Not hypothetical land, not mythic land, but a real, sprawling subcontinent we now call Beringia. It once connected Alaska and Siberia, a vast steppe of grasslands, rivers, and tundra ridges stretching more than 1,000 miles wide. People didn't just pass through it, they lived there. And then, the ocean rose. Beringia is the great erased homeland of North America's earliest settlers. A bridge, yes, but more than that. It was a world. For over 10,000 years, during the last glacial maximum, it remained exposed, habitable, and biologically rich. Herds of bison and mammoth grazed the plains. Wolves and foxes left their tracks in the frost. And humans, yes, humans were there too, hunting, gathering, moving, adapting. We know this not just because it makes ecological sense, but because the genetic evidence demands it. Modern DNA studies point to a standstill. population groups of people who paused in Beringia, genetically isolated, for millennia before moving south into the Americas. This isn't fringe theory anymore. It's the prevailing model. But here's the brutal twist. Almost none of their campsites have been found. Why? Because most of Beringia is underwater. After the Ice Age ended, sea levels rose over 400 feet, swallowing the lowlands, flooding river valleys, and submerging the very terrain where these early people would have lived. What was once mammoth-tracked tundra is now the bottom of the Bering and Chukchi seas, cold, dark, and virtually inaccessible to archaeological excavation. So the mystery becomes not, did people live there, but where did they live, and can we ever find them? Archaeologists have tried. They've modeled ancient coastlines. They've mapped submerged river deltas. They've even used sonar and bathymetry to identify potential ancient landforms, places where a campsite could have been. But underwater archaeology in the Bering Sea is expensive, dangerous, and slow. So far, no unequivocal submerged human habitation site from Beringia has been found. Which leaves us with a tantalizing hole in the record. We know these people existed. We can trace their genetic signatures. We can find their descendants' tools in Alaska's interior. But their own homes, hearths, and pathways remain lost beneath the waves. Still, not everything was drowned. Some high-elevation areas of eastern Beringia, what's now western Alaska, remained above water. And in those places, archaeologists have uncovered tantalizing clues. Sites like Swan Point, Dry Creek, and Walker Road show human presence dating back as far as 14,000 years. These weren't coastal populations, but they bordered the drowned world. Their tools may echo techniques developed earlier, closer to the vanished shorelines. Then there are the Paleo River systems. As sea levels dropped during the Ice Age, massive rivers now submerged would have carved through Beringia, forming fertile valleys and natural migration corridors. These rivers would have attracted game, supported fresh water, and offered navigation routes. If campsites existed, they likely clustered along these riverbanks. And now those riverbanks lie hundreds of feet beneath modern sea level. What's especially cruel about the mystery is that coastal zones are where we'd expect to find the richest evidence. Coastal groups often had more stable food sources, fish, shellfish, sea mammals, which would support larger, longer-term settlements. And yet, these very zones are the ones most vulnerable to sea level rise, erosion, and sediment burial. There are glimmers of hope. Technological advances like sub-bottom profiling, remote-operated vehicles, and underwater coring are beginning to peel back the layers of the sea floor. In the coming decades, we may begin to locate Beringian camps not through traditional excavation, but through geochemical traces, microfossils, or submerged cultural layers. But for now, the camps remain out of reach, their fires long cold, their tools scattered by currents, their bones, if any remain, cloaked in sediment. And yet, the idea of them still hums beneath every shovel strike in Alaska. Every inland site is haunted by the knowledge that the real story, the origin story, is probably sitting in the mud somewhere off the continental shelf, just beyond our reach. The people who stood on Beringia's windswept ridges watched the sea come in. They didn't know it then, but they were watching their homeland vanish. And they moved inland, upstream, up valley, anywhere the water didn't follow. Some of them climbed to the serpentine hot springs, where the earth still rumbled under their feet and the stones still split in their hands. And maybe, just maybe, what they were building there wasn't a camp at all, but a sanctuary. Serpentine hot springs' sacred landscape? If you travel deep into Alaska's Seward Peninsula, past the last roads, the last villages, into the raw bones of the land, you'll find a place that feels like it belongs to some other world. Serpentine Hot Springs, nestled among granite tors and permafrost plains, is a place that contradicts its surroundings. Steam rises from the ground even in the dead of winter. The rocks are warm to the touch. Water flows where everything else freezes. And dotted around this geothermal oddity, beneath the looming stone spires, are clues that ancient people not only visited, but stayed. The question is, why? The archaeological evidence at Serpentine Hot Springs includes quarry sites, house pits, and stone tools, suggesting periodic use over millennia. What stands out isn't just the presence of people in such a remote, rugged place, it's the repetition. Generations return to this spot, not casually, deliberately. And this raises a bigger question. Was Serpentine just a convenient stopping point? Or was it something more? A ritual center? A healing site? A place of power? Let's start with the landscape itself. The terrain is dramatic. Massive granite tors, stone pillars, and spires jut out of the tundra like the worn-down teeth of forgotten gods. These aren't ordinary rock formations. They dominate the skyline. They impose. And in many indigenous Arctic traditions, features like these carry spiritual significance. They aren't just background, they're beings, or at least the homes of beings. Spirits of land, stone, and weather. Now add the hot springs. In an environment where warmth is precious, here is a place where heat rises from the earth itself, where water doesn't freeze, even at 40 below. It's no stretch to imagine ancient visitors viewing this place with reverence or awe. A crack in the world, where the normal rules didn't apply. A place you entered not just physically, but spiritually. Some archaeologists suggest that Serpentine may have functioned as a liminal space, a threshold between the human world and something deeper. A place where rituals could be performed, where power could be accessed, where ancestors could be heard. Others argue it was more practical, a quarry site with high-quality stone, a warm resting point in an unforgiving landscape, a predictable stop along inland travel routes. The truth is, it was probably both. The presence of quarrying activity supports the practical side. The granite tors around the springs produce stone that can be flaked into tools. Ancient people likely chipped and shaped materials here, taking advantage of the accessible raw material. House pits nearby suggest temporary dwellings, possibly seasonal camps or hunting bases. But even these utilitarian features don't exclude symbolic meaning. In many traditional societies, places of labor and places of ritual aren't separate categories. You can work in a sacred space. You can pray while quarrying. What we don't see, at least not clearly, are long-term settlements. That absence might mean Serpentine wasn't a place to live, but a place to visit, to journey to return to when the time was right. That's a different kind of geography, not one defined by distance, but by meaning. Then there's the ecological oddity. Hot springs in a permafrost environment create unique microclimates. Plants grow differently. Animals behave differently. Snow melts faster. Fog gathers. The sensory experience alone would be surreal, warm steam rising from the ground, while ice forms in your beard. It's easy to imagine this contrast shaping myths, rituals, narratives. Modern native groups have indeed attached stories to Serpentine. Some speak of its healing properties. Others tell of spirits that dwell beneath the rocks. These oral histories don't date back to the earliest inhabitants, but they echo. There's also the matter of orientation. Some researchers have noted that house pits and quarry sites at Serpentine are arranged in ways that suggest deliberate placement, possibly aligning with features of the landscape. This could be practical shielding from wind, or symbolic oriented towards specific tors or natural formations considered spiritually charged. In that way, the architecture of the site becomes less about survival and more about relationship, how humans situate themselves in a living, breathing landscape. The hot springs weren't just a natural feature, they were a participant in the human story, a constant presence in a world defined by flux. And then there's the silence. After all the quarrying, all the visiting, all the firelit nights under the stars, Serpentine Hot Springs doesn't develop into a village. It doesn't become a hub. It doesn't grow. It remains a place apart, marginal, intense, unforgettable. That stasis is itself a clue. It suggests the people who used this land didn't want to change it. They wanted to meet it, on its terms. Maybe they left offerings in the steam. Maybe they whispered names into the mist. Maybe they watched the water bubble up from the cracked earth and remembered where they came from before the ice, before the flood, before the coast sank into the sea. And maybe that's the thread that leads us next. Not to more dwellings or tools, but to messages carved in stone, symbols that face the sea, eyes that look back. Because on Kodiak Island, at Cape Alatac, the rocks speak, and no one knows quite what they're saying. Kodiak's Cape, Alatac petroglyphs. If the windswept cliffs of Cape Alatac, at the southern tip of Kodiak Island, could speak, they might ask why we stopped listening. Carved into the basalt rock faces that ring Alatac Bay are hundreds of petroglyphs, spirals, animals, humanoid figures, masks, birds, whales, handprints, strange geometric patterns, and eyes. Always eyes. Some figures are etched with broad, sure strokes. Others are delicate, tentative, almost hidden in the weather-worn stone. They look out at the sea. They face the sky. They cluster near freshwater streams and gather at tidal edges, and they raise one long, unanswered question. What were they for? Cape Alatac contains one of the most dense and varied petroglyph concentrations in Alaska. The carvings are so numerous, in fact, that many remain undocumented. And yet, despite the scale of the site, the carvings were largely unknown to the outside world until the 20th century. It wasn't until the late 1992 and early 2002 that formal efforts to catalog and protect the site began in earnest, led in part by members of the Alatac community, descendants of the ancient carvers themselves. But even with community involvement and archaeological attention, the truth is, no one knows exactly what these symbols mean. Radiocarbon dating of nearby habitation sites suggests that many of the petroglyphs were carved between 500 and 2,500 years ago, with some potentially even older. They were created using hammerstones and pecking techniques, stone on stone, mark by mark, until the surface of the basalt yielded its dark glaze to lighter, rougher textures beneath. In other words, these were intentional works, carved with time and effort. So, the question becomes, were they art, writing, ritual, or record? One interpretation sees them as spiritual icons, a visual language tied to cosmology, shamanic practice, and ancestral memory. Many of the images, particularly the humanoid figures with exaggerated eyes and headdresses, may represent shamans, spirit beings, or mythological entities. In this reading, Cape Alatac becomes a sacred site, a place where rituals were conducted and spirits were invoked, not for tourists or future archaeologists, but for survival, healing, and cosmological balance. Another theory treats the carvings as territorial markers laid down by family groups or clans to claim rights over hunting grounds, fishing spots, or sacred places. This aligns with patterns observed in other indigenous cultures, where rock art serves both social and spiritual functions. The presence of petroglyphs near freshwater sources and salmon streams supports this idea. This is our place. These are our ancestors. Then there's the narrative model. Some scholars believe the petroglyphs may represent stories, legends passed down through generations and anchored in visual form. If true, each cluster of images might not be random, but sequential. A storyboard, a history, a song made visible. Unfortunately, without a written tradition to accompany the imagery, any attempt to decode such stories is speculative at best. What complicates the matter further is the variation in the carvings. Some are large and bold, carved high on cliff walls, visible from the water. Others are tiny, hidden in crevices, only visible when sunlight hits at just the right angle. Some figures are repeated across sites. Others appear unique, isolated. This range suggests that multiple purposes were at play. Not a single system, but layers of meaning, overlapping and evolving across time. And here's where things get stranger. Some petroglyphs at Cape Alatac bear an uncanny resemblance to images found thousands of miles away in Northeast Asia along the coastlines of the Russian Far East. Spiral motifs, anthropomorphic masks, and bird-human hybrids crop up again and again across time zones and languages, hinting at a shared symbolic vocabulary that may have traversed the Bering Sea long before Europeans knew it existed. Is this evidence of cultural exchange? Parallel evolution? Or are we simply seeing what we want to see? No one knows, but it forces us to consider the possibility that these carvings weren't just personal, they were relational, tied into a broader Beringian worldview where land, sea, and spirit weren't separate domains but interwoven strands of the same fabric. There's also the Alutiic perspective to consider. Contemporary descendants of the carvers interpret some petroglyphs as representations of family lineage, birth, transformation, and cosmic cycles. These interpretations aren't always testable in archaeological terms, but they offer something the rock alone cannot: context. What remains haunting, though, is the silence of the stones. Unlike written language, petroglyphs don't explain themselves. They don't translate. They don't footnote. They just remain etched into basalt, slowly weathering under wind and salt, staring back across the centuries. And Cape Alatac is not alone. Because farther southeast, near the town of Wrangell, there's another stretch of stone carved with mystery, a beach that floods and empties with the tide, revealing figures only when the water pulls back. Another gallery, another enigma. Because even when you carve your message into stone, the ocean decides who gets to read it. Petroglyph Beach, Wrangell. On the southeastern edge of Alaska, just outside the quiet town of Wrangell, there's a place where the past waits for the tide to recede. Petroglyph Beach isn't particularly large. The rocks aren't towering or dramatic. No sweeping cliffs, no volcanic spires. Just a modest patch of intertidal stone that twice a day reveals what centuries have hidden. A scatter of carved figures, pecked into the shore like whispers etched in salt. There are dozens of petroglyphs here, some easy to spot, others only visible when the light slants just right across the rock. They range in subject: stylized faces with deep eyes, spirals, sunbursts, rings, geometric forms. Some images are repeated, others stand alone. Some look simple, almost playful. Others seem deliberate, formal, ritualistic. No one knows exactly when they were carved. Estimates vary wildly, from as early as 8,000 years ago to as late as just a few centuries before European contact. The lack of direct dating methods for stone carvings leaves researchers with little more than comparative guesses based on stylistic similarities, local oral traditions, and proximity to known archaeological layers inland. But one thing is clear: the petroglyphs weren't casual. They weren't idle doodles. These were intentional acts, performed on a slippery, salt-swept canvas that disappears twice daily beneath the ocean. And that raises the fundamental question: why carve something you know the sea will wash away every few hours? Some suggest they mark tide cycles, lunar patterns, or seasonal fish runs, messages embedded in the shoreline for those who knew how to read them. In a region where salmon defined the rhythm of life, a carved sun or circle could be more than art. It could be a calendar, a signal, a promise that the fish would return. Others argue the carvings are spiritual, part of rituals tied to the sea. In this interpretation, the act of carving into the intertidal zone was itself symbolic, a way of speaking to ocean spirits, or ancestors, or the forces that govern success and failure on the water. The sea would come in, touch the carvings, and carry the message out again. And then there's the social theory, that Petroglyph Beach was a kind of public gallery, a place where families, clans, or visiting groups left their mark. In a pre-literate society, Such visual signatures might function like territorial tags, totemic emblems, or spiritual identifiers. Carve your symbol, and your story stays even if your village moves, even if generations pass. But there's another, darker possibility. Maybe the petroglyphs are all that's left. Because we know this area was once home to rich, complex indigenous cultures, Tlingit, Haida, and others, many of whom lived along these coasts for thousands of years. Oral histories, clan systems, ceremonial sites, longhouse villages, most of it erased, shifted, or hidden by centuries of colonization, forced assimilation, and historical silence. The petroglyphs, then, aren't just carvings, they're survivors, stone memories from a time before written language, before borders, before ships arrived on the horizon, messages that outlived their messengers, and they remain a point of pride and mystery for local communities. The Wrangell Cooperative Association and others have worked to protect the site, document the carvings, and reconnect them to indigenous interpretations. And yet, the carvings resist easy classification. There's no master key, no index, no singular meaning. That ambiguity is part of their power. Because in a world obsessed with clarity, these stones offer something more valuable: presence without explanation. You can stand on that beach, between tide lines, and feel something looking back at you. Something made by hands that knew the ocean, the moon, the fish, and the stone, and chose to leave behind a voice with no mouth. And if Petroglyph Beach speaks in riddles, then just offshore, across the ragged chain of the Aleutians, lies a more ancient question, one that sits not in carvings, but in buried tools and volcanic ash. A place where humans lived almost at the edge of the continent, and maybe at the edge of the world's memory. Anangula, Aleutians how early, and by what route? At the far southwestern edge of Alaska, almost leaning into the Pacific, lies Anangula Island, a small, wind-blasted piece of land in the Aleutian archipelago, just west of Umnak Island. It's not the kind of place most people end up by accident. The vegetation is low, the weather unforgiving, and volcanic peaks loom in the distance. And yet, more than 9,000 years ago, people came here. They didn't just pass through, they stayed, they built, they adapted. And then, something happened. The Anangula site was first excavated in the 1932nd and later revisited with more precision in the 1962nd and beyond. What archaeologists found was astonishing: a deeply buried cultural layer beneath layers of ash from a massive volcanic eruption. Stone tools, blade cores, flake debris, hearths, evidence of a semi-permanent settlement dating to about 8,400 to 9,000 years ago. One of the earliest known occupations in the Aleutian chain. The people who lived at Anangula were skilled flint knappers, making finely crafted microblades, much like those found in earlier Siberian and Beringian traditions. They likely hunted sea mammals, birds, and fish, and may have used boats to navigate the treacherous channels between islands. Their presence here raises a massive question. How did they get here, and why this early? The Aleutians aren't easy territory. Rugged cliffs, unpredictable weather, strong currents. You don't casually island hop through this region. The fact that people reached and settled Anangula this early suggests a deliberate coastal migration, possibly originating from earlier groups along the southern Beringian coastline, or even from Northeast Asia. This supports the increasingly robust theory of a coastal migration route into the Americas, one that bypassed the interior ice corridors and instead followed the kelp-rich, resource-dense shorelines from Asia across the now drowned Beringia and down into the Americas. In this model, the Aleutians are not peripheral, they're central. But Anangula complicates things. The earliest occupation layers are abruptly cut off by a massive volcanic eruption, likely from nearby Okmok caldera, which covered the site in meters of ash. The eruption didn't just bury the camp, it may have ended it. Afterward, the site shows little evidence of continued use for some time. This raises another question. Did the eruption sever a cultural thread? Was Anangula part of a broader network of early coastal settlements that was disrupted by environmental catastrophe? Or was it an isolated outpost, cut off from the mainland and unable to recover? We don't know, but what's fascinating is what the Anangula tools don't show. There's no pottery, no clear signs of intensive marine adaptation, no fishhooks, no nets. It suggests a people still in transition, figuring out how to live on the sea's terms. Early arrivals, learning fast. Some archaeologists argue that Anangula represents an initial pulse of coastal migration, one that didn't take root long term. Others believe it's part of a deeper, submerged record that's mostly been lost beneath the sea. After all, much of the early Aleutian coastline is now underwater. Like Beringia, the best evidence may be out of reach. Still, the presence of a 9,000-year-old human camp on this tiny, windswept island is undeniable. These were not people hugging the land. They were crossing water, building shelters, shaping tools, making fire, living, even at the margins of what the continent allowed. And they didn't vanish. Not entirely. Because just a few islands away, in a cave high above the surf, another mystery waits. One with bones, wrappings, and faces preserved by salt and time. A question not just of arrival or survival, but of how the dead were treated in a land surrounded by sea. Kagamill Island mummies. Out in the middle of the Aleutian Islands, swept by wind and waves and the mournful cries of seabirds, sits Kagamill Island, a place barely large enough to be named, let alone remembered. But for centuries, if not millennia, this rocky outcrop was the final resting place for the dead. Not buried, not burned, but placed in caves, wrapped in woven materials, with skin and sinew astonishingly preserved. This is the site of the Unangan Alut mummies, and what they left behind is not just a funerary practice, it's a cultural riddle. The cave mummification tradition of the Unangan people is both striking and rare. Bodies were prepared with care, cleaned, wrapped, sometimes posed. Many were placed in high-elevation caves along cliffsides that faced the sea. There they remained, shielded from weather and animals by the natural dryness and the cave's cold microclimate. When Russian explorers and early American scientists first encountered these mummies in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they did what colonizers have often done when confronted with indigenous practices they didn't understand. They took them. Dozens of mummies, men, women, children, were removed from caves and shipped to museums, universities, and private collections. Some were studied, others simply vanished. What they left behind were stories with missing endings. The Unangan mummies raise a dozen unanswered questions. First and foremost, how old is this practice? Some researchers believe the earliest mummified remains date back nearly 2,000 years, though solid radiocarbon dates are limited. Others suggest it could be much older, and that the lack of older mummies reflects both preservation bias and the destructive history of excavation. What's clear is that this wasn't a one-time tradition. It was repeated, generational, structured, and that implies meaning. So why mummify in the Aleutians, a place of salt, storm, and minimal resources? Unlike Egypt or Peru, where mummification often signals hierarchy or divine kingship, Unangan practices appear more egalitarian. Many mummies were found with few grave goods. Some had none at all. They weren't encased in gold or stone. They were wrapped in grasses, bird skins, and animal hides, materials that were available but required careful craftsmanship. That craftsmanship, in turn, hints at a deeper structure. This wasn't casual preservation. It was intentional preparation. The deceased were not hidden from the world, they were placed with visibility in mind. Facing the sea, aligned to light, sometimes stacked, other times individually placed. One possibility is that these were ancestor shrines, places where the dead maintained an active spiritual presence among the living. Visitors might come to commune with them, leave offerings, or draw on their wisdom. In this model, the mummy isn't a memorial, it's a participant. But there are other theories. Some scholars argue that mummification was reserved for certain roles within Unangan society, perhaps shamans, leaders, or people who died under unusual circumstances. The absence of standardized grave goods complicates this theory, but the consistency of treatment across mummies suggests shared belief, even if the criteria for mummification remain unclear. There's also the enigma of technique. How exactly were the bodies preserved? Some evidence suggests evisceration, removal of organs may have occurred in certain cases. In others, natural desiccation may have been aided by placement in dry, cold caves. There's no written record of the process, no detailed oral tradition that has survived. All that remains are the bodies and the silence around them. And then there's the question of motivation. Was this an attempt to ensure safe passage into the afterlife? A way to maintain spiritual presence in this one? Or something more pragmatic? A method of honoring the dead when burial wasn't feasible in volcanic, rocky soil? We don't know. But what we do know is that the mummies of Kagamill Island are some of the best preserved human remains in the North Pacific. And their presence challenges assumptions about the technological and ceremonial sophistication of early Arctic and subarctic societies. These weren't people passively reacting to a harsh environment. They were shaping meaning from it, claiming it, honoring their dead with care that transcended survival. And just a few islands east, the bones of a different creature tell a different story altogether. Not a burial, not a ritual, but an extinction. Because on Street Paul Island, long after the mammoths disappeared from the rest of the world, a tiny population clung to survival quietly, against all odds, until the fresh water ran out. The fate of Street Paul Island's last mammoths. Imagine a world where mammoths still roamed as the pyramids were being built, where woolly giants walked beneath northern skies long after their continental cousins had vanished from Earth. It's not science fiction, it's Street Paul Island, Alaska, where a tiny, isolated population of mammoths survived thousands of years after their extinction elsewhere, until one day they were gone. Street Paul Island is a remote, windswept volcanic speck in the Bering Sea, part of the Pribilof Islands. It's not large, about 40 square miles, but during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, it was part of a much broader landscape. Herds of mammoths roamed the region freely, grazing on grasses and shrubs alongside bison, caribou, and other megafauna. As the climate warmed and the glaciers melted, sea levels rose, the lowlands flooded. What was once a vast, open range became a chain of island refuges. Most of these were eventually swallowed by the ocean. But Street Paul remained. There, for thousands of years, mammoths persisted. And then, somewhere around 5,600 years ago, they disappeared. Not because of overhunting, not because of a sudden climate catastrophe, but because of something far more mundane and far more terrifying in its simplicity. They ran out of fresh water. That's the leading theory, backed by an interdisciplinary study involving paleontology, sediment core analysis, and ancient DNA. Researchers discovered that, over time, the island's freshwater sources, lakes and ponds, began to shrink. The island's size, reduced by rising seas, meant less area to capture rainfall and snowmelt. The changing climate brought drier conditions. Sediment samples taken from lake beds on the island show a steady decline in aquatic vegetation, diatoms, and other freshwater indicators. Around 5,600 years ago, they drop off a cliff. And right around the same time, mammoth bones stop appearing. There's no smoking spear point, no sign of mass kill sites, just a slow, ecological suffocation. The last mammoths of Street Paul may have died of thirst, or of starvation as vegetation failed, or from cascading effects, disease, competition, desperation. However it happened, it was likely gradual at first, then sudden, a final generation, cut off by the limits of their island. And what makes this even more unsettling is the genetic evidence. Studies show that the Street Paul mammoths experienced what's called a genetic bottleneck, reduced diversity due to isolation. Over time, their gene pool shrank, leading to an increase in harmful mutations. In other words, they were already fragile, even before the water disappeared. This was no thriving colony, it was a stranded one. So what we're left with is not a story of violent collapse, but of gradual erasure, of an animal out of time, kept alive by geography and luck until geography turned against it. And while this is a story about mammoths, it's also a mirror, a warning about the limits of resilience, about how quickly the edge of survival can become a cliff. Because if a single environmental change, one pond drying out, can erase a species that had survived the Ice Age, what does that say about us? And more pressingly, what did the people of prehistoric Alaska know about these mammoths? Did they see them, hunt them, remember them? No direct evidence connects human populations to the Street Paul mammoths, but memory has a way of outlasting presence. And far to the north, in a place where winters never end, the bones of another creature, not extinct, but no longer living in the way we understand it, leave behind thousands of footprints. Because, in the heart of ancient Alaska, dinosaurs walked through snow, and somehow, they made it work. Denali's dinosaur winter problem. Deep in the heart of Denali National Park, beneath the peaks that scrape the roof of the sky, something ancient waits just below the surface. Not gold, not oil, not bones, footprints. Thousands of them, pressed into what was once a riverbank, now fossilized into slabs of shale and sandstone, a parade of tracks left behind by creatures who by all logic shouldn't have been there. Because these were dinosaurs, and they were walking in the Arctic. Roughly 70 million years ago, the region that would become Denali wasn't quite as frigid as today. It was farther north than it is now, already within the Arctic Circle. But during the late Cretaceous, the planet was warmer overall. There were no polar ice caps. Ferns and conifers blanketed the land. Rivers braided across floodplains. It wasn't a frozen wasteland, but it also wasn't a tropical paradise. Winters were still long, still dark, still cold. And yet, the dinosaurs came. The fossil record in Denali includes the tracks of hadrosaurs, duck-billed plant eaters, theropods, meat eaters, likely related to raptors and tyrannosaurs, and even pterosaurs, flying reptiles whose wingprints have been fossilized alongside those of their grounded cousins. Some of the tracks are tiny, left by hatchlings. Others are massive, indicating adults the size of buses. All of them tell the same story. This wasn't a seasonal migration stop. This was home, which raises an uncomfortable question for paleontologists. How did they survive the winter? Because even in a warmer Cretaceous world, Arctic Alaska had months of darkness, cold snaps, and food scarcity. Not unlike today, except with fewer convenience stores and no central heating. Dinosaurs weren't mammals. They weren't hibernating bears or fur-coated caribou. They were reptiles, cold-blooded by traditional understanding. And that understanding no longer fits. So scientists have had to get creative. One possibility: dinosaurs weren't actually cold-blooded, at least not in the way modern reptiles are. Recent studies suggest many species, especially theropods and hadrosaurs, had high metabolic rates, closer to birds than to lizards. They may have been mesothermic, capable of internally regulating their temperature to some degree. Not quite warm-blooded, but warm enough. Another theory: insulation. Fossil evidence from elsewhere shows that some small theropods had proto-feathers not for flight, but for warmth. Imagine Arctic raptors with downy coats, huddling together for warmth, their young nestled close. Not Jurassic Park monsters, more like wild turkeys with teeth. And then there's behavior. Perhaps Arctic dinosaurs were seasonally adaptive. They may have followed food sources, fed on bark, stored fat, or lived in herds that provided communal protection. Some may have migrated short distances to lower elevations, avoiding the worst of winter without ever leaving the north. Still, none of these theories fully explain how they thrived. Because the tracks don't just show survival, they show activity, patterns of movement, group behavior, signs of play and care. Some tracks even suggest dinosaurs nesting in these regions, raising young who would be too small to migrate. These weren't guests, these were residents. And that's the real mystery. Because for years, the assumption was that Arctic dinosaurs migrated to warmer regions like birds do today. But the evidence in Denali and other Arctic sites like the Prince Creek Formation suggests something far more astonishing. They stayed. Which means our vision of dinosaurs must change. No longer just creatures of tropical jungles and steaming swamps. They were also creatures of twilight, of snowmelt, of the long dark. Survivors of a cold, sunless season, masters of contradiction. And if you think it stops with Denali, think again. Because farther north, where the ground never truly thaws, paleontologists uncovered something even stranger. Not just the footprints of Arctic dinosaurs, but the remains of their babies. Bones so small, so fragile, they could only belong to one thing. Nesting grounds. Which changes everything. Did Arctic dinosaurs stay year-round? In the barren expanse of Alaska's Prince Creek Formation, where the wind carves through rock and permafrost like a slow-moving blade, paleontologists found what they weren't supposed to find: perinates. Infant dinosaur bones, tiny femurs, delicate vertebrae, remains of animals so young they couldn't possibly have migrated. Too small, too undeveloped. They were born here. And that means one thing. Dinosaurs were nesting in the Arctic. Let that settle for a moment. Not passing through, not following a seasonal loop. Living, breeding, and raising their young in a place where the sun disappears for weeks on end. A place where snow covers the ground for much of the year, and where temperatures, even during the relatively warm Cretaceous, still dropped low enough to challenge the warmest-blooded among us. The site in question lies along the Colville River, near Alaska's North Slope, and the fossils found there belong to a range of species: hadrosaurs, troodontids, dromaeosaurs. Some of the bones are still developing, showing signs of growth plates and unossified joints. In other words, newborns. For years, researchers assumed that dinosaurs at these latitudes must have migrated to avoid the cold and darkness. After all, that's what many animals do today: caribou, birds, even modern humans. But the infant bones upend that logic. They couldn't walk hundreds of miles. They couldn't store fat for the journey. If they were here, then so were their parents. And they weren't just scraping by. Growth ring studies in bones suggest that these dinosaurs were not stunted by their Arctic upbringing. They grew at rates comparable to their southern relatives, which means they had enough food, warmth, and shelter to not just survive, but thrive. How? Several theories circulate. First, the possibility of burrow nesting. Some smaller theropods may have dug burrows, insulating their eggs and hatchlings against the cold. Others might have built mound nests, using decaying vegetation to generate warmth, much like some modern birds and reptiles do today. Then there's social behavior. Nesting in groups could provide protection, warmth, and communal care. Hadrosaurs, often considered the cows of the Cretaceous, may have raised their young in herds, guarding them in the darkness and leading them to food-rich patches during the brief but intense Arctic summers. Another key factor: light doesn't equal life. During the Cretaceous, polar regions experienced long periods of darkness, but not the brutal cold we associate with today's Arctic. Even during winter, the lack of solar radiation didn't necessarily mean sub-zero temperatures. Think twilight instead of ice. Still, darkness poses another challenge. Vision. Could dinosaurs see in the dark? It's possible. Some species, like troodontids, had large eyes and expanded optic lobes, suggesting excellent night vision. They may have hunted or foraged during twilight and moonlight, adapting their behavior to the unique photoperiods of polar latitudes. And there's the evolutionary wild card, feathers. Many small theropods likely had feather coverings, not for flight, but for insulation. Combined with higher metabolisms, this could have given them a thermal edge in chilly environments. But here's the twist. Arctic dinosaurs didn't evolve into something fundamentally different. They weren't their own subspecies. They weren't dwarfed or misshapen. They were just dinosaurs, living at the edge of habitable range, doing what they'd always done, eating, growing, nesting, just with a longer night sky. Which brings us to the philosophical turn. If dinosaurs could survive in the cold, in the dark, in the uncertainty of polar seasons, what really killed them? Was it the asteroid, the volcanic winters? Or were they more vulnerable to sudden change than we realized? The Arctic record tells a story of endurance, not weakness. And the fossils, frozen into place, are still telling it quietly, bone by bone. But the surprises aren't over. Because, alongside the dinosaurs, another group adapted to polar extremes. Not reptiles, not mammals, birds. And in a shocking twist, we may have just found the oldest nesting site for polar birds, one that rewrites the timeline yet again. Polar birds, nesting with dinosaurs. Just when you think the Arctic fossil record has exhausted its capacity for surprise, it coughs up something small, fragile, and implausible. A bird's nest. Or rather, fragments of one. Delicate, scorched, wind-worn traces of a time when birds, yes, polar birds nested not just in the chill of northern Alaska, but in the age of dinosaurs. The site is once again in the Prince Creek Formation, the same fossil-rich region that's already rewritten our assumptions about Arctic dinosaurs in their year-round residency. But in 2025, researchers working along a fossil-bearing horizon near the Colville River announced something new, the oldest known evidence of polar bird nesting. Tiny eggshell fragments, avian limb bones, sediment patterns consistent with nesting behavior, all dated to the late Cretaceous, more than 70 million years ago. This means that not only were some birds living in the ancient Arctic, they were raising their young there, in darkness, in cold, in the presence of tyrannosaurs. Which naturally raises a cascade of questions. What birds were these? How did they survive the conditions? And why here? The fossils haven't yet yielded full skeletons, but morphological clues, bone shapes, microscopic eggshell structures, suggest a link to the Ornithurae, a group of advanced birds that includes modern species. These weren't feathered dinosaurs masquerading as birds, they were the real evolutionary article, and they were already nesting in one of the most ecologically extreme environments on the planet. So, how did they manage it? One possible answer, endothermy. These birds, like their dinosaur cousins, were almost certainly warm-blooded. With high metabolisms and insulating feathers, they could generate enough heat to regulate their body temperature in cold climates. That gave them an advantage, allowing them to forage in chilly conditions and stay active during the long polar twilight. But that doesn't solve the parenting problem. Because nesting in the Arctic isn't just a question of temperature. It's about light, food, predators, and timing. Did these ancient birds lay their eggs in early summer, squeezing their breeding season into the brief window of midnight sun? Did they incubate in darkness? Did their chicks grow fast, as in modern seabirds, reaching maturity before the first frost? Some researchers suggest the birds may have borrowed strategies still seen in modern polar birds. For example, today's Arctic terns and snow buntings time their nesting with explosive insect hatches, feeding their young during the few weeks when food is absurdly abundant. Perhaps these ancient birds evolved similar instincts, triggered by temperature, daylight, or plant cycles to align reproduction with opportunity. There's also the question of site fidelity. Were these birds returning to the same nesting grounds every year, generation after generation? That kind of behavior implies more than adaptation, it implies memory. A cultural transmission of place, passed down in flight and instinct. And if that's the case, then the cliffs above the Colville River aren't just sedimentary archives. They're ancestral nesting cliffs, used for tens of thousands of years before anyone ever called it Alaska. The presence of birds also complicates the ecological picture. These aren't solo actors, they're part of a web. If birds were nesting here, there were insects to feed on, plants to hide in, dinosaurs to avoid, perhaps even early mammals waiting for an egg to go unwatched. The Cretaceous Arctic, once imagined as a hostile, empty landscape, is now looking more and more like a teeming seasonal biome. And again, we face the same realization. These creatures weren't just surviving, they were thriving in a space that modern humans still find marginal. They weren't pushing the edge, they were the edge. That reframes the Arctic entirely, not as a barrier, but as a frontier, not as a fringe, but as a hub. A place where species met, evolved, and pioneered new adaptations that would echo for millions of years. And those echoes don't stop in the Mesozoic. Because after the asteroid, after the mammals rose, after the ice returned, the Arctic continued to be a crucible for cultural and ecological innovation. And many millennia later, on another Arctic shoreline, another pioneering culture set up camp. They weren't dinosaurs. They weren't birds. They were humans, and their new kind of house tells us just how fast Arctic life could change. Early Thule, at Cape Espenberg. On the coast of the Seward Peninsula, where the land flattens into the Chukchi Sea and the wind writes permanent lines in the sand, lies Cape Espenberg, a place that doesn't announce its significance. You could stand on the gravel beach, listening to the seals offshore and the gulls above, and never guess you're standing on the remains of a Thule frontier settlement, one that holds the earliest known evidence of Thule expansion into northwest Alaska. And what's preserved here is more than a campsite. It's a revolution in architecture, technology, and survival strategy. In the early 2010 archaeologists excavating at Cape Espenberg uncovered a nearly intact Thule-era house, an oval, semi-subterranean dwelling framed with driftwood and whalebone, insulated with sod, and organized with clear interior divisions. Radiocarbon dating pushed its occupation back to around AD 1200, making it one of the earliest Thule structures known in the region. But this wasn't just another Arctic home. It was a pivot point proof of a new people, with new methods, entering a new land. So who were the Thule? Descended from earlier Bering Strait cultures like Birnirk, the Thule were the ancestors of today's Inupiat and other Inuit peoples. But unlike their predecessors, the Thule weren't merely adjusting to Arctic life, they were mastering it. They built large houses, hunted whales in coordinated crews, crafted sophisticated toggling harpoons, and traveled by dog sled and umiak across frozen seas and open waters. And Cape Espenberg shows us the moment that transformation arrives. The house at Espenberg wasn't a fluke. It was planned, engineered, and built to last. Driftwood logs formed the main supports. Whalebones reinforced the roof. Inside, archaeologists found soapstone bowls, worked ivory, and metal tools. Some likely hammered from trade items or salvaged meteorite. The house wasn't just functional, it was cosmopolitan. What's especially intriguing is how quickly this architecture spreads. Within a few centuries, Thule-style houses appear all across the North American Arctic, from Alaska to Greenland. That's a continental takeover by any definition. But it's not one of conquest. It's one of efficiency. The Thule didn't erase the Arctic. They outperformed it. And how did they do it? Some credit the medieval warm period, a stretch of relatively mild climate from roughly AD 950 to 1250. Thinner sea ice allowed easier navigation. Whale populations may have expanded their range. Coastal areas became more accessible. The Thule were ready, with the tools and knowledge to seize that opportunity. Others emphasized technological synthesis. The Thule combined innovations from across Beringia obsidian blades, toggle harpoons, boat building, lamp-fueled heating into a toolkit that could dominate every ecological niche the Arctic offered. But culture was key, too. Thule society emphasized cooperation, particularly in whale hunting. Large game required group effort, coordination, and trust. This social cohesion gave the Thule a resilience that extended beyond tools. Their homes weren't just shelters, they were social engines. And yet, even in the midst of this expansion, traces of the past remained. The Espenberg house sits atop older cultural layers, hinting at continuity as well as change. The newcomers didn't settle in empty lands. They arrived where people had already lived and likely adapted, borrowed, and blended as they went. Which means the Thule weren't starting over. They were building on memory. And that memory deepens when we look west, to the ancient settlement of Wales, Kingigan, where houses, tools, and stories stretch from Thule roots all the way to the present day. A place where time doesn't just pass. It resides. Wales, Kingigan, deep continuity. At the far western tip of the Seward Peninsula, where Alaska almost touches Russia, lies Wales, known in Ipiutak as Kingigan. It is the westernmost city on the North American mainland, but it's more than just a geographic footnote. It's a time capsule, a place where centuries compress into layers and where the bones of houses sit just below the footprints of schoolyards. Kingigan has been occupied, almost without interruption, for over 1,000 years, making it one of the longest continuously inhabited communities in the Arctic. Archaeological excavations around the whale sites have revealed a stacked timeline: Birnirk, Thule, Punuk, and eventually modern Inupiaq cultures all layered like pages in a half-buried book. The past isn't just remembered here, it's residing underneath the living room. But how continuous is continuous? And what does that even mean in a place where ice moves, people migrate, and cultural borders blur? That's where the mystery begins. The oldest structures at Wales date back to the Birnirk culture, roughly 500–900 AD, thought to be one of the key cultural ancestors of the Thule and modern Inuit populations. These were semi-subterranean dwellings, reinforced with whalebone and driftwood, insulated with sod, and oriented toward the sea. The tools found within ivory harpoon heads, toggling tips, oil lamps show a people tuned to the ocean's rhythms, already exploiting bowhead whales with remarkable precision. By around 1000 AD, the Thule had arrived, either replacing or blending with local populations. Their houses were larger, more structured. They brought advanced whaling tools, dog sleds, and long-distance trade connections. Objects made of meteoritic iron and Eurasian copper have been found at some Thule sites in the region, suggesting trade routes that spanned thousands of miles, even pre-contact. Yet at Wales, this wasn't a wipe and replace scenario. There is evidence of overlap cultural motifs, architectural hybrids, and artifact styles that blur the boundaries between one group and the next. Rather than a sequence of occupations, the site reads more like a conversation between generations. One of the most striking features of the whale sites is the consistency of place. Despite centuries of change in climate, population, and politics, people kept coming back to the same location, building new houses atop the remains of old ones, repurposing whalebone frames, redigging storage pits. This suggests that Wales wasn't just a good spot, though its access to sea mammals, fish, and driftwood certainly helped. It was a storied place, a place tied to identity. Oral histories from Ipiutak elders reinforce this idea. They speak of ancestral homes, whale hunts, and spiritual sites that stretch back into a deep, unbroken past. Names of places haven't changed. Stories match what archaeologists dig up. The land remembers, even when the surface changes. And then there's the proximity to Russia, just 55 miles away across the Bering Strait. Wales has always been at the edge of two continents, and in many ways, it's been a cultural bridge. Even before modern political borders were drawn, people crossed the ice, sailed between coasts, traded goods, and married across the water. You could argue Wales wasn't a margin, it was a hub. This trans-Beringian connection is still visible in artifact styles. Decorative motifs from old Bering Sea cultures, especially ivory carvings with swirling patterns and zoomorphic figures, appear in both Siberian and Alaskan contexts. The trade of metals, seal oil, walrus ivory, and even ceramic styles flowed in both directions. Wales, perched between two worlds, absorbed and reinterpreted them. But there's also discontinuity hidden within the continuity. Periods of abandonment, drastic changes in house orientation, gaps in occupation layers, perhaps due to climate shifts, epidemics, or resource collapse. Continuity here doesn't mean peace. It means persistence. And what's most mysterious is that some of the later structures from the 1702nd and 1802nd are built with techniques and materials that echo their ancient counterparts: whale bone rafters, carved harpoon heads, soapstone lamps. In some cases, almost nothing changes. Imagine that. A child growing up in 1750 could have sat in a house with the same basic layout, heated with the same kind of lamp, cooking the same kind of seal meat as a child who lived 1,000 years earlier. That's not just tradition, that's temporal recursion, Arctic style. And it raises the kind of question that archaeologists hate and philosophers love. When does a place stop being the past and start being the present? And when the land has seen everything, from birch sleds to satellite dishes, what kind of secrets does it still refuse to give up? Perhaps answers lie not in the houses, but in the water, in the rivers that once burst through the mountains. Because in the interior of Alaska, far from the whale bones and coastal trades, something massive once moved. Not slowly, not gently, but as a catastrophic inland sea, hunting for a way out. Lake Atna's megafloods. Before there was Alaska as we know it, before the glaciers retreated, before the rivers carved their current courses, there was Lake Atna, and it was enormous. This wasn't just a lake in the casual sense. This was a Pleistocene superlake, formed as massive glaciers blocked drainage valleys in south-central Alaska. At its peak, Lake Atna sprawled across nearly 9,000 square miles, filling the Copper River basin like a shattered bowl, pressing up against mountain walls, quietly waiting for its opportunity to burst. And burst it did! Not once, not slowly, but in a series of catastrophic megafloods that tore through the land, stripping soil, moving boulders the size of cars, and leaving behind scars so large they're still visible from satellite imagery today. But here's the mystery. How many times did it flood? How big were the outbursts? And what exactly triggered them? The science isn't settled, and every new sediment core only deepens the uncertainty. Let's rewind. Roughly 16,000 to 10,000 years ago, as the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets began to melt, glacial tongues pushed into the valleys surrounding what is now the Copper River Basin. These glaciers dammed up the basin's natural drainage, trapping meltwater into what eventually became Lake Atna. At its highest, it reached elevations over 975 meters, with water depths in some areas estimated at over 200 meters. To put it in context, it was deeper than any modern Alaskan lake. It held more water than Lake Erie. If you lived in interior Alaska during its reign, you lived next to an inland ocean. Eventually, that much water had to go somewhere. And when it did, it went fast. Geologists believe that outburst floods occurred when the ice dams holding Lake Atna back began to weaken or fail altogether. The release wasn't a gentle trickle, it was a tsunami of fresh water, carving channels, depositing massive gravel bars, and triggering landslides in every direction. The floods likely surged through the Matanuska and Susitna valleys, possibly reaching the Cook Inlet and reshaping coastlines along the way. One particularly telling piece of evidence is the presence of giant current ripples, massive wave-like formations of gravel and sediment that stretch for miles, each one as tall as a house. You don't get those from a typical spring melt, you get those from geologic chaos. And yet, researchers still debate the frequency and magnitude of these floods. Some suggest there were multiple outbursts, spaced over centuries. Others argue for a single, overwhelming cataclysm. The lack of consistent dating makes the story frustratingly ambiguous. But even more intriguing is what these floods might have interrupted. There are early human sites in Alaska, like Dry Creek and Swan Point, that may have been active around the same time as Lake Atna's final stages. Did the floods displace people, wash away settlements, cut off travel routes, or did they go unnoticed, happening in uninhabited valleys no one dared to cross? No human remains have been found directly within Atna flood deposits, but absence isn't proof. Just because we haven't found the footprints doesn't mean they weren't washed away. And here's where the story twists again. Some geologists think Lake Atna wasn't just a lake, it was a recurring threat. Filling, draining, refilling. A ghost body of water, lurking in the landscape. Its presence may have defined migration routes, influenced where animals gathered, even shaped the myths of people who arrived much later. So, perhaps what we're left with is not just a mystery of where the water went, but of what it erased. Ecosystems drowned, valleys gutted, evidence lost in the churn. And if we look at the timeline, Lake Atna's disappearance overlaps eerily with the vanishing of another mystery group, the ancient Bingians. Not the first to arrive, but the first to leave no goodbye. Because if the floods didn't erase them, something else did. Ancient Bingians, after 8000 BP. They were here early, so early in fact, that their genetic signature doesn't fit neatly into any of the later lineages that spread across the Americas. They're called the ancient Bingians, a now extinct population whose existence was discovered not through bones or tools, but through a double burial of 2 infant girls, unearthed at the Upward Sun River site in the Tanana Valley. Their remains were dated to around 11,500 years ago, and their DNA offered something previously unknown, a glimpse of a people that split from all other Native American populations, but didn't appear to leave descendants. In other words, a dead-end branch of humanity. But here's the catch. These infants are not the only mystery. In recent years, geneticists have uncovered further hints, like a child's tooth from Trail Creek Cave on the Seward Peninsula, clustering with the same ancient Beringian lineage, yet dating several thousand years later. That tooth, dated to about 9,000 years ago, suggests the group didn't vanish immediately. They lingered. And yet, by around 8000 BP, before present, the genetic signature disappears. Gone from the landscape, replaced or absorbed by later populations, and no one knows how or why. The term extinct doesn't quite capture the ambiguity. It's not that they died in some mass event we can point to, no volcanic ash layer, no glacier surge, no smoking meteorite. It's more like they dissolved. Their lineage either blended into others, leaving no visible trace, or was quietly pushed to the margins of history and never made it back. Which opens the door to speculation, a lot of it. Some researchers propose that the ancient Beringians were eventually absorbed into incoming populations from the North or West groups related to later Paleo-Eskimo and Neo-Inuit traditions. In this model, their genetic signal was diluted over generations, overwritten by migration and admixture. Their language culture, and identity may have morphed, lost in the long tide of Arctic adaptation. Others suggest a more abrupt end, perhaps environmental change like the draining of Lake Atna or the submergence of Beringia cut them off from key resources or travel corridors. Perhaps they lived in lowland zones that are now underwater, and the reason we haven't found more of their remains is simply because those remains are beneath the ocean, unreachable and forgotten. It's not hard to imagine a world in which early groups found themselves increasingly hemmed in by geography and newcomers, the ice retreating, the seas rising, the pressure mounting. And what's haunting is that their material culture remains stubbornly invisible. Unlike the Clovis culture of the lower 48, or the Denbigh and Norton complexes that would come later in Alaska, the ancient Beringians left behind almost nothing distinctively theirs, no toolkit with a name, no art, no longhouse ruins, just a few scattered bones, some hearths, and a genetic ghost. Even their language is lost. Linguists can't tie them to any known Native American language family. They existed before those families diverged, before Athabaskan, before Na-Dene, before anything spoken on the continent today. Which means that whatever words they used for river, sky, or death, they are now unspeakable. So what does it mean then, to have been first and forgotten? It's a question with moral weight. These weren't proto-humans. These were fully modern people. They lived in families, hunted, built fires, carried children, mourned their dead. They had names, stories, cosmologies. But the silence of archaeology makes them feel more shadow than substance, like a rumor that history keeps repeating without explaining. And yet, their disappearance opens space for a larger narrative, one not about extinction, but about transformation. Maybe the ancient Beringians didn't vanish. Maybe they became something new. Maybe they are not gone, just unrecognized. Their bones intermingled, their genes reabsorbed into the living fabric of the North. After all, identity isn't fixed, it's fluid, just like the floodwaters that once carved through the valleys they may have called home. And that brings us to a different kind of transformation, one carved not in genes or memory, but in ivory. Because just as the ancient Beringians faded, another cultural world was rising on the coast. A world of swirling lines, intricate faces, and objects so beautiful, no one agrees on what they were actually for. Norton versus Northern Maritime Art Worlds. Somewhere between the driftwood plains of the Norton Sound and the frozen coastline of the Bering Strait, an aesthetic revolution quietly unfolded. It was subtle at first, a carved ivory handle here, a figurine there. Then, as centuries passed, the objects became more intricate, more abstract, more impossible to categorize. The Norton tradition, dating from roughly 1000 BC to 800 AD, was already rich in material culture. Norton sites show early pottery, stone lamps, toggling harpoons, and a way of life rooted in both land and sea. These people hunted sea mammals, fished, gathered, and settled in coastal villages. Their tools were practical, their architecture solid. The art, while present, was relatively subdued. Then something changed. Around the same time that Norton culture began to decline, or transform between 500 and 1000 AD, archaeologists began to find a new style emerging along the western coasts, the Northern Maritime tradition. This wasn't just an evolution of Norton, it was something else entirely, something ornate, symbol-laden, and explosively expressive. Objects from this tradition are covered in incised patterns, geometric swirls, animal motifs, and ambiguous faces. Many are made from walrus ivory, painstakingly etched with fine lines, sometimes filled with pigment. Some scholars attribute this style to the old Bering Sea, OBS, and Aukvik cultures, which may have overlapped with or succeeded the late Norton horizon. And yet, despite hundreds of recovered artifacts, maskettes, combs, labrets, amulets, no one can agree on what these objects meant. Were they status symbols? Ceremonial offerings? Personal charms? Political markers? The answer is yes, and also maybe not. Some pieces appear mass-produced, implying trade or gifting networks. Others are so idiosyncratic they must have been made for individual use. Still others are found in burials, suggesting spiritual or ancestral significance. And yet, the motifs repeat spirals, crosshatches, stylized animal forms across vast distances, from Street, Lawrence Island to the Siberian coast. Which raises the question, how did this art world rise as the more subdued Norton tradition faded? Was it cultural competition? A response to environmental change? A political shift? One theory suggests that as coastal resources became more variable due to climate fluctuation, or overuse groups began to distinguish themselves through visual identity, art became a way of asserting territory, ancestry, or divine favor. In other words, style became strategy. Another view is that northern maritime art emerged from escalating ritual complexity. As societies grew larger and more socially stratified, the need for symbols increased. Objects began to carry spiritual weight, mediating between human and non-human realms. Some motifs may reference sea spirits, animal guides, or mythic ancestors, but without written language, we can only guess. And guess we have. Anthropologists have called the art shamanic, totemic, narrative, and even cosmological. But each label is a placeholder for something deeper, a set of meanings we no longer understand, carved into ivory with the calm certainty of people who absolutely did. And perhaps the most ironic mystery is this: the more we study the art, the less confident we become about its origins. Norton and northern maritime sites often overlap in time and space. Some artifacts appear in both contexts. There is no neat dividing line, just a long, tangled braid of cultural transition where one thread fades and another takes its place without ever fully breaking. In that sense, the Norton to maritime shift isn't a puzzle to be solved. It's a palimpsest, a reworking of old forms into new ones, a visual echo, and one of those echoes, oddly enough, carries the unmistakable ring of metal. Because on the other side of the Bering Strait, centuries before the Russians arrived, someone was already importing Eurasian metal into Alaska, and no one knows how. Eurasian metal, before Europeans. Long before ships from Europe ever scraped their keels across the Alaskan coast, long before maps dared imagine the curves of the Bering Sea, and long before history officially began taking notes, metal was already moving between continents. Not coins, not cannonballs, but small fragments, tools, beads, slivers of copper, bronze, and even iron found in archaeological layers that predate European contact by centuries. In western Alaska, particularly around the Bering Strait, researchers have uncovered artifacts made from non-native metals, metals that could only have originated in Eurasia. This includes bronze artifacts on Street, Lawrence Island, iron tools embedded in ivory harpoon heads, and copper objects in late Punuk and old Bering Sea culture sites. Some of these items date to as early as 1000 AD, 5 centuries before Vitus Bering ever sailed within shouting distance. So, how did they get here? Let's start with the materials themselves. Alaska doesn't have much in the way of natural sources for copper or iron, especially not in the far west. And the few sources that do exist don't match the chemical signatures of the objects in question. Using metallurgical analysis, researchers traced many of these metals to Siberian origins, especially regions around the Lena River and the Central Asian steppes. That suggests one thing: pre-contact trans-Bering trade networks were real, active, possibly ancient. We're not talking about caravans or longships here. We're talking about skin boats, sleds, human feet, and oral contracts. This wasn't empire-driven commerce. It was interpersonal, local. But it spanned continents. Some of the items found in Alaska are made of cast bronze, a technology that didn't exist among indigenous Alaskan cultures at the time. Others contain wrought iron, hammered into shape, likely the result of recycling old tools or repurposing trade scrap from Asia. The presence of iron-working slag and early forges in Siberian contexts adds weight to the theory. Siberian peoples were not only producing metal, but likely sharing or trading it across the strait. But here's where it gets hazy. There are no clear records of this trade, no inscriptions, no maps, no logs, just the objects themselves, scattered and silent. The movement of metal seems to have occurred along informal, decentralized routes, possibly passed hand to hand between families, villages, or seasonal camps. A bead made in Yakutia could have passed through a dozen settlements before reaching the Norton Sound. It's tempting to view this as proto-globalization, but it's more accurate to call it a deep-time localism, a network of exchange that didn't need writing or government or markets to function. Just people, relationships, and memory. And those relationships were long-standing. The indigenous peoples on both sides of the Bering Strait, Yupik, Chukchi, Inupiat, share not just genetic and linguistic ties, but cultural parallels that stretch back millennia, shared tool forms, similar house styles, nearly identical whale hunting techniques. The metal trade, in that context, isn't an anomaly. It's a logical extension of a connection that predates metal by thousands of years. So why does this matter? Because it reframes the timeline. The idea that indigenous Alaskans were culturally and technologically isolated before European contact is simply false. They were part of an Arctic world that was dynamic, interconnected, and fully capable of adapting, adopting, and improving on foreign materials. It also raises a philosophical question. What counts as first contact? If metal from Eurasia made it into Alaskan hands 5 centuries before European ships arrived, does that count as contact? What about stories that cross the ice? Songs? Designs etched into ivory that mirror Siberian motifs? Are we measuring history by sails or by signals? More provocatively, how much knowledge was lost when European colonization restructured the Arctic? If metal was already in circulation, what other technologies, beliefs, or relationships vanished before they could be written down? And finally, there's the haunting fact that most of these metal artifacts show signs of wear and repair. They were treasured, maintained, not disposable, which suggests that the people who possessed them understood their value not just as tools, but as symbols of status, of ancestry, of connection to a world far beyond the shore. And yet, for all the objects we found, there's something conspicuously missing. If ancient Alaskans were receiving metal from the West and thriving along the coasts in an age before nations, where are their villages? Where are the workshops, the fish camps, the boatyards? Which leads us to the final mystery. Because if ancient mariners traveled the southeast coast of Alaska, settling and fishing along the edge of the world, why have their homes vanished? The missing coastal camps of Southeast. In the moss-draped fjords and rainforest-carved cliffs of Southeast Alaska, history hides behind every tree root and tide pool. Towering peaks plunge into misty bays, salmon fight upstream through centuries. And along the coast, the ocean licks at a mystery that has baffled archaeologists for decades. Where are the early coastal settlements? We know people were here. The genetic and archaeological evidence is clear. Ancient populations followed a coastal migration route down the Pacific Rim, likely arriving in the Americas as early as 16,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. Sites like On Your Knees Cave on Prince of Wales Island have yielded 10,300-year-old remains that show a clear maritime adaptation. Early humans harvesting fish, shellfish, and sea mammals. But that's just one site. And therein lies the problem. If humans hugged the coast during their migration, and they almost certainly did, then there should be hundreds of sites, Fishing camps, boat landings, shell middens, seasonal dwellings, fire pits, bone piles, tools, all the expected residue of a life lived near water. Instead, what we have is a conspicuous silence. The archaeological record along southeast Alaska's coast is frustratingly sparse, especially when compared to interior river valleys or Arctic tundra. The question isn't whether people were there, it's why we can't find them. And there are several theories. First, submersion. During the last ice age, global sea levels were significantly lower. Much of the continental shelf now underwater was dry land. Early coastal camps, built on what was once the shoreline, are now beneath the ocean. Entire landscapes may be hidden under silt, kelp, and salt water. Second, erosion. The southeast Alaskan coast is an aggressive place. Rainfall is constant, tides are extreme, landslides, tsunamis, and earthquakes are frequent. Organic materials like wood, bone, and even stone structures don't stand a chance. If early people built temporary structures using natural materials, nature may have erased every trace. Third, visibility bias. The rainforest itself is a kind of camouflage. Dense vegetation covers everything. Even when sites exist, they're hard to find. Modern archaeological methods like LiDAR and remote sensing are helping, but large portions of the coast remain unstudied, especially the less accessible islands and inlets. Fourth, cultural practice. It's possible early coastal peoples moved frequently, used lightweight or perishable materials, and left minimal footprint. A mobile society built for subsistence might not leave behind monumental architecture or dense middens. Their presence would be ephemeral by design. But maybe the most unsettling possibility is this. The evidence did exist, but it's already gone. Rising seas, logging, urban development, looting, taphonomic decay. Every year that passes without a new discovery is another year where coastal prehistory risks being permanently lost. And this matters, not just academically, but philosophically. Because the southeast coast was not an edge, it was a gateway, a lifeline, a corridor through which entire continents were peopled. The fact that we can't trace those footsteps is a wound in our understanding of early human movement, a reminder that absence doesn't mean emptiness. It's also a cautionary tale. For all our satellites and sonar, we still don't know the full story. And we may never. The ocean doesn't give up its secrets easily. It swallows. It reclaims. It reworks the land until history becomes geology. And so, we end where we began in the fog, on a coastline where the first mariners may have landed, looked around, and built fires that burned into the night. Unrecorded, unnamed, unfound, but not unimportant, because their silence still echoes, and their mystery, like so many in Alaska, refuses to stay buried.